Imagine this. The year is 1947. The Second World War has been over for less than 2 years. The United States military is the most powerful fighting force in human history. It has just defeated 2 industrial empires simultaneously on opposite sides of the planet. Its soldiers have stormed beaches under machine gun fire. Its pilots have flown through flak so thick it blotted out the sun. Its navy has ruled every ocean on Earth. These men are not afraid of anything. And yet, in the southernmost corner of our planet, something happened that the official records still struggle to fully explain. A task force of nearly 5,000 soldiers, sailors, and scientists sailed into the Antarctic ice with enough supplies for 8 months of operations. They carried aircraft, they carried submarines, they carried enough firepower to start a small war. They came home in 8 weeks, not because the mission was complete, not because of a change in orders from Washington, not because of anything the public was ever fully told. They simply left. The operation had a name, Operation Highjump, and on paper, it looked like the most ambitious polar expedition in the history of human civilization. 13 ships, 23 aircraft, 4,700 military personnel. Led by one of the most decorated admirals in American naval history, Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, the man who had already made 4 previous expeditions to Antarctica and was considered the world's foremost expert on the continent. The stated mission was scientific: mapping, exploration, establishing a permanent American presence in Antarctica before the Soviet Union could do the same. The Cold War was just beginning to crystallize, and the frozen South was unclaimed territory, a geopolitical prize that no superpower had yet locked down. That was the official story. And official stories, as we have learned time and again, are often the beginning of a much more interesting question. Let me give you the scale of what was assembled for this mission, because the numbers matter. 13 ships does not sound like much until you understand what those ships were. The task force was divided into 3 separate groups: the Western Group, the Eastern Group, and the Central Group, which included the flagship USS Mount Olympus and the aircraft carrier USS Philippine Sea, an aircraft carrier sent to Antarctica to conduct scientific research. The Philippine Sea was carrying 6 Douglas R-4D Skytrain transport aircraft and 6 Martin PBM Mariner flying boats. These were not light reconnaissance planes. These were serious, heavy aircraft built for long-range operations. The submarine USS Senate accompanied the fleet. Let that detail settle for a moment. A combat submarine in Antarctic waters for a mapping expedition. The total displacement of the fleet exceeded 100,000 tons. The budget, adjusted for today's values, would have run into the billions of dollars. This was not a research trip. This was a military operation. Now, here is the question that every serious researcher of this episode eventually arrives at. If you were planning an 8-month expedition to the most remote and hostile environment on Earth, would you take a submarine? Would you take an aircraft carrier? Would you classify the majority of the expedition's findings for decades? Because that is exactly what happened. Large portions of the data, photographs, and reports generated by Operation Highjump were classified by the United States government and remained inaccessible to the public for years. Some materials were only partially declassified. And even today, researchers and historians note that the complete photographic record of the expedition has never been fully released. Ask yourself why a scientific mapping mission would need to classify its maps. Richard Byrd is the human center of this story, and we need to understand who he was to understand why his words after the expedition carry such extraordinary weight. Byrd was born in 1888 in Winchester, Virginia, into one of the most prominent families in American history. The Byrds of Virginia were political aristocracy. Richard Evelyn Byrd was not a man prone to fantasy or exaggeration. He was a naval officer, a navigator, a pilot, and an explorer of the most rigorous scientific tradition. He was the first person to fly over the North Pole in 1927. He was the first to fly over the South Pole in 1929. He had spent so much time in Antarctica that the continent had become, in a sense, his second home. This was a man of discipline, a man of facts, a man who had built his entire reputation on precision and verifiable achievement. Which is exactly why what he said after Operation Highjump hit like a thunderclap. In a press interview following the early termination of the expedition, Byrd made a statement that should have been front-page news in every newspaper in the world. Instead, it was quietly noted, partially reported, and then largely buried under the noise of post-war reconstruction and the rising anxiety of the Cold War. He said, and I am drawing from documented sources, that the United States needed to be prepared for a defense against enemy aircraft that could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. Read that again. Enemy aircraft flying from pole to pole at incredible speeds. In 1947. The fastest conventional aircraft in the world at that time could barely exceed 900 kilometers per hour. The Soviet Union had not yet tested its first atomic bomb. Commercial aviation was still in its infancy. The idea of aircraft flying from pole to pole at incredible speeds was not just unexpected, it was technologically impossible for any known nation on Earth. So who, exactly, was Byrd warning about? That is the question that has haunted researchers, historians, military analysts, and ordinary curious people for nearly 80 years. And in this video, we are going to follow the evidence wherever it leads. We're going to look at what the official records actually say. We're going to examine the classified documents that have been partially released. We're going to look at the testimony of participants. We're going to examine the geopolitical context of 1947 with fresh eyes. And we're going to ask the hardest question of all. What did they find down there? Because something made 5,000 battle-hardened American soldiers pack their equipment, abandon an 8-month mission after 8 weeks, and sail home with classified orders, classified photographs, and a story that the American public has never been fully told. Before we go deeper into the expedition itself, we need to understand something fundamental about Antarctica. Most people have a vague impression of Antarctica as simply a very large, very cold place. An ice desert at the bottom of the world. Penguins, blizzards, endless white nothingness. The reality is far stranger and far more complex. Antarctica is a continent the size of Europe and Australia combined. It holds 90% of the world's fresh water, locked inside a sheet of ice that in some places reaches a thickness of nearly 5 kilometers. Beneath that ice is an entire hidden world. Mountain ranges that dwarf the lakes, liquid lakes, sealed under kilometers of ice, that have been isolated from the surface for potentially millions of years. Geological formations that we are still only beginning to map with modern technology. And something else. Something that the early polar explorers noticed with unease, and that modern researchers continue to document with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. Antarctica does not behave the way a simple frozen continent should. The magnetic anomalies in certain regions are extraordinary and difficult to explain with conventional geology. The subglacial topography, the shape of the land under the ice, contains formations that researchers continue to debate. And the behavior of certain atmospheric and electromagnetic phenomena in the polar regions has been a subject of serious scientific and military interest since the early 20th century. Let us go back to 1947, to the moment when the fleet assembled. When the sailors looked out at their ships and their aircraft and their weapons and their supplies, and prepared to sail into the last great unknown of the modern world. Most of them had no idea what they were sailing into. Most of them had no idea what they would experience in those 8 weeks. And most of them came home with orders not to talk about what they had seen. 5,000 soldiers, 8 weeks. A classified retreat from the most remote place on Earth. What were they running from? Stay with me. The man who conquered both poles. To understand Operation Highjump, you first have to understand the man who led it. Because Richard Byrd was not assigned to this mission by accident. He was not simply the most qualified candidate on a list. He was, in a very real sense, the only person alive who could have been given this. And the story of how he became that person is itself a remarkable journey through the most dangerous corners of the 20th century. Winchester, Virginia, 1888. The Byrd family was not merely wealthy, they were woven into the fabric of American history in a way that very few families ever achieve. Senators, governors, military officers, landowners. The Byrds had been shaping Virginia politics since before the Revolution. Richard was born into a world where excellence was not encouraged. It was expected. He was a sickly child, frequently ill, frequently underestimated. The kind of boy that history sometimes likes to transform into something extraordinary precisely because he had so much to prove. He entered the United States Naval Academy in 1904 and graduated in 1912. He trained as a naval aviator at a time when aviation itself was barely a decade old, when flying an airplane was still considered an act of controlled lunacy. And then he started doing things that nobody had ever done before. In May of 1926, Byrd and his pilot Floyd Bennett took off from Spitsbergen in Norway in a tri-motor Fokker aircraft called the Josephine Ford. 15.5 hours later, they claimed to have flown over the geographic North Pole and returned. The world erupted. Byrd was hailed as a hero of the First Order. Congress awarded him the Medal of Honor, ticker tape parades, front pages across the globe. He had done what explorers had dreamed of for centuries. He had stood, metaphorically, at the top of the world. There has been historical debate since then about whether his navigation calculations were entirely accurate, whether he actually reached the precise geographic pole or came close but not quite. Some researchers, examining his diary entries published decades later, have suggested the numbers do not fully add up. But here is what is not debated. He flew. He returned. He pushed the absolute boundary of what aviation could achieve at that moment in history. And he did it again. 3 years later, in November of 1929, Byrd did something even more extraordinary. From a base camp in Antarctica that he named Little America, located on the Ross Ice Shelf, he took off in a Ford tri-motor aircraft with 3 crew members and flew south, due south, into the most hostile airspace on the planet. Over the trans-Antarctic mountains, through a mountain pass at an altitude that nearly killed them when the aircraft struggled to gain enough height and they had to dump emergency supplies to reduce weight, and then out over the vast white plateau of the polar ice cap. And on the 29th of November, 1929, Richard Byrd and his crew became the first human beings to fly over the South Pole. He had now stood at both ends of the Earth. No human being in history had done that. But what most people do not know, and what is absolutely critical to understanding his role in 1947, is what happened during Byrd's third Antarctic expedition in 1934. This was perhaps the most psychologically defining experience of his life. Byrd decided to spend an Antarctic winter alone, entirely alone, at a weather station called Advance Base, 123 miles south of Little America, buried under the ice, with temperatures outside dropping to negative 70 degrees Celsius. The stated reason was scientific: to gather meteorological data from an interior location. But reading his memoir from that period, a book called Alone, published in 1938, you get the unmistakable sense of a man testing himself against the most extreme solitude the planet can offer. He nearly died. A faulty stove was slowly poisoning him with carbon monoxide fumes over a period of weeks. He was too ill to operate the radio properly, too proud and too isolated to send a clear distress signal. By the time his colleagues at Little America realized something was deeply wrong and mounted a rescue mission through the Antarctic winter darkness, Byrd was barely alive. He survived, but he was never quite the same. The man who returned from that winter station had looked directly into the void and come back changed. He was still disciplined, still rigorous, still formidably intelligent. But there was something else now, a depth of reflection, a willingness to sit with uncomfortable truths that men who had not faced what he faced did not possess. Keep that in mind as this story develops, because when Byrd made his extraordinary statements after Operation Highjump, the statements that Washington clearly wished he had not made, he was not a young man seeking fame or a reckless officer chasing headlines. He was a 58-year-old rear admiral with more polar experience than any living human being, a Medal of Honor recipient, a man who had stared at death in an underground bunker for 4 months and written honestly about what that experience had done to him. When a man like that says something that does not fit the official narrative, you pay attention. By the time 1947 arrived, Byrd had completed 4 Antarctic expeditions. He knew the continent the way a sailor knows the sea he has crossed a dozen times. He knew its weather patterns, its dangers, its geography, its moods. He had established base camps. He had flown over mountains that had no names. He had mapped coastlines that no human eye had ever seen. Which is precisely why the Pentagon chose him to lead Operation Highjump. And which is precisely why, when the mission collapsed after 8 weeks, his words carried a weight that nobody in Washington could simply dismiss. Now let us talk about what Byrd actually said, because this requires some careful unpacking, and the details matter enormously. The most cited statement comes from an interview Byrd gave to the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio on the 5th of March, 1947, shortly after the expedition had been cut short and the fleet was beginning its return journey. This interview is documented and has been referenced by historians and researchers for decades. In that interview, Byrd spoke about the strategic importance of Antarctica. he spoke about the need for the United States to take the polar regions seriously as zones of potential military vulnerability. And then he said something that stopped readers cold. He warned that in the event of a new war, the United States could be attacked by aircraft flying over one or both poles. He described the possibility of enemy aircraft that could fly from one polar region to another with a speed that made traditional defense strategies obsolete. Now, some historians have interpreted the statement in relatively conventional terms. The Cold War was beginning. Soviet bombers, theoretically, could approach North America via the Arctic route over the North Pole. This was actually a genuine strategic concern that would drive American defense planning for the next 2 decades, eventually leading to the construction of the Distant Early Warning Line, the DEW line radar network across the Arctic in the 1950s. That interpretation is reasonable as far as it goes, but there is a problem with it. The problem is context. Byrd was returning from Antarctica, from the South Pole region. He was speaking in the context of an expedition that had just been abruptly terminated. And he was not speaking in a dry strategic briefing for military planners. He was speaking to a newspaper in unusually emotional and urgent language, in a way that several people who knew him described as out of character for his normally measured public persona. The word he used, according to translated accounts of the interview, was not calculated strategic concern. It was something closer to warning, urgent warning. And there was another interview, this one in 1955, before Byrd's final Antarctic expedition, Operation Deep Freeze. In this interview, Byrd described Antarctica as a land of everlasting mystery. He said that it was the most valuable piece of real estate in the world, and he used a phrase that has been analyzed and debated endlessly since. He described it as a land of perpetual mystery. Not scientific mystery, not geographical mystery, just mystery. From a man who had spent more time in Antarctica than virtually any other human being alive. There is one more layer to the Byrd story that we need to address, because it speaks directly to the question of what he knew and when he knew it. In 1956, Richard Byrd led his 5th and final expedition to Antarctica as part of the International Geophysical Year preparations. He was 68 years old. He flew over the South Pole one final time on the 15th of January, 1956, becoming the only person to have flown over the South Pole twice in his lifetime. He died on the 11th of March, 1957. He was 68 years old. He never gave a full public accounting of what happened during Operation Highjump. He never explained the discrepancy between the planned 8 months and the actual 8 weeks. He never publicly elaborated on his warning about aircraft flying from pole to pole. And he went to his grave, having seen things in Antarctica that, if his colleagues and contemporaries are to be believed, he discussed in private with a weight and gravity that was entirely disproportionate to what a scientific mapping expedition should have produced. So who was Richard Byrd? He was the most credentialed Antarctic explorer in American history, a Medal of Honor recipient, a man who had faced death alone under the ice, a rear admiral, a careful, precise scientist and navigator who had built his entire life on verifiable achievement. He was not a conspiracy theorist. He was not a man given to fantasy. And yet, he came back from Operation Highjump and said things that the United States government clearly wished he had kept to himself. That tension between what Byrd was and what Byrd said is one of the central mysteries of this entire story. Now we need to turn to the expedition itself, to the ships, to the men, to the 8 weeks that changed everything. Because what happened out there on the ice was stranger and more disturbing than anything that appears in the official record. Into the ice, the fleet sets sail. December of 1946. The Southern Hemisphere summer was just beginning. In the ports of Norfolk, Virginia, and in the Panama Canal Zone, 13 ships were being loaded with a quantity of equipment and supplies that would have seemed excessive for any mission described primarily as scientific exploration. Fuel, aviation fuel in particular, in quantities that suggested an aerial campaign rather than a survey expedition. Food supplies calculated for 8 months of operations for nearly 5,000 men. Weapons, ammunition, cold weather gear on a scale that the United States military had only recently developed, drawing on bitter lessons learned in the frozen hell of the Aleutian Islands campaign and the Battle of the Bulge. And aircraft. So many aircraft. Let us count them carefully, because the air component of Operation Highjump tells its own story. 6 Douglas R-4D Skytrain transport aircraft. These were military versions of the legendary DC-3, workhorses of the war, capable of carrying heavy loads over long distances. 6 Martin PBM Mariner flying boats, large patrol aircraft designed for long-range maritime reconnaissance. 6 Sikorsky HO-3S helicopters. 2 Curtiss SOC Seagull floatplanes. 1 Stinson Sentinel light observation aircraft. 23 aircraft in total for a mapping expedition. To put that in perspective, consider that the entire Antarctic mapping mission, led by Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen, the first man to reach the South Pole, had involved 0 aircraft, because aircraft did not yet exist. The first aerial survey of any portion of Antarctica had only occurred in 1928. The idea that you needed 23 aircraft to map a coastline was, to anyone who thought carefully about it, extraordinary. Unless you were not just mapping. The fleet departed in late December of 1946, heading south from the tip of South America toward the Antarctic pack ice. The journey itself took several weeks, and from the very beginning, the expedition encountered conditions that even veterans of Antarctic operations found unusual. The weather was violent in ways that the meteorological predictions had not fully anticipated. Storms that came from directions that did not match the established patterns for that time of year. Sea states that made operations difficult and, in some cases, dangerous before the fleet had even reached the edge of the pack ice. This was not unprecedented. Antarctica is the most meteorologically active region on Earth. The continent generates its own weather systems with a ferocity that no other landmass can match. Katabatic winds, cold, dense air flowing down from the polar plateau, can reach speeds exceeding 200 kilometers per hour with almost no warning. The Southern Ocean is the roughest body of water on the planet. Every Antarctic expedition in history has dealt with conditions that exceeded expectations. But the veterans among Byrd's crew noted something. The conditions in December of 1946 and January of 1947 felt different, more hostile, more sustained, less predictable even by Antarctic standards. Several crew members would later describe this in interviews and personal accounts. The sense that the continent itself was resisting them. The fleet divided into its 3 operational groups as it approached Antarctica. The Western Group, built around the destroyer USS Henderson and several support vessels, was tasked with operating along the western Antarctic coastline. The eastern group, centered on the seaplane tender USS Pine Island, would operate along the eastern coastline. And the central group, the largest and most powerful, built around the aircraft carrier USS Philippine Sea and the command ship USS Mount Olympus, would establish the main base of operations near Little America on the Ross Ice Shelf. Little America was familiar ground for Byrd. He had built it himself during his first expedition in 1928 and 1929. It had been expanded and rebuilt during subsequent expeditions. By 1947, it was a small but functional base, partially buried under the ice, with structures that had survived multiple Antarctic winters. But even returning to familiar ground brought unexpected complications. The Ross Ice Shelf is one of the most extraordinary geological features on Earth. It is a floating platform of ice the size of France, attached to the Antarctic continent, extending out over the Ross Sea. Its face, the barrier as early explorers called it, rises anywhere from 15 to 50 meters above the waterline and extends below the surface to depths of 200 to 900 meters. When Byrd's fleet arrived at the Ross Ice Shelf in January of 1947, they found that the ice conditions had changed significantly since his previous expeditions. The barrier in certain sections had calved, broken away, leaving the coastline different from the charts they had brought with them. Navigation had to be adjusted. Landing zones that had been planned in advance were no longer accessible. This was the first serious operational setback. It would not be the last. The establishment of the main base camp proceeded with the military efficiency you would expect from an operation of this scale. Equipment was unloaded, aircraft were assembled, communication networks were set up, scientific instruments were deployed. The 6 R-4D transports were fitted with special ski landing gear that allowed them to operate on the Antarctic snow and ice surface. The flying boats were launched from the Philippine Sea and began their patrol patterns. The operation was, by all official accounts, proceeding according to plan. But beneath the surface of the official reports, something else was happening. The men were nervous. This is not a characterization invented by later researchers. It appears in the personal diaries and letters of expedition members that have surfaced over the decades. It appears in interviews given by veterans years, and in some cases, decades after the fact. It appears, reading carefully between the lines, even in some of the official communications from the period. The nervousness had several sources. The first was the environment itself. Even for men who had served in the Pacific and European theaters of the Second World War, Antarctica was psychologically overwhelming in a way that combat, paradoxically, sometimes is not. Combat is terrifying, but it is comprehensible. There are enemies and allies. There are objectives and obstacles. There is a human framework within which even the most extreme violence makes a kind of sense. Antarctica offers none of that. It is a landscape of almost incomprehensible scale and silence. The light in the Antarctic summer does not behave the way light behaves anywhere else on Earth. The sun circles the horizon without setting, casting long shadows that move in slow circles, rather than the familiar arc of sunrise and sunset. The ice plays tricks with sound, with distance, with perception. Objects appear closer or farther than they are. Sounds carry for impossible distances, then disappear without explanation. Several crew members reported a pervasive sense of being watched, of not being alone in a place where they demonstrably were alone. The second source of nervousness was more concrete. Aircraft were disappearing. Not all at once, not dramatically, but beginning in early January of 1947, the expedition began losing aircraft in numbers and under circumstances that the official records have never fully explained. The Martin PBM Mariner flying boats were particularly affected. These were large, capable aircraft. Their crews were experienced. Antarctic flying is dangerous, and accidents do happen. Engine failures, navigation errors in whiteout conditions, fuel exhaustion. These are the explanations that appear in the official accident reports. But the timing and frequency of the losses troubled even the most pragmatic officers in the expedition. And there was one incident in particular. An incident involving a crew from the Eastern Group operating in the waters near the Thurston Peninsula that generated a report so unusual that it was classified at a level significantly higher than the rest of the expedition's documentation. The details of that incident are still not fully in the public domain. What we know is this. A Martin PBM Mariner, call sign George 1, went out on a routine reconnaissance flight on the 3rd of January, 1947. It did not return on schedule. When it finally made radio contact, the transmission was fragmented and described by the operators who received it as unlike anything they had heard before. The aircraft eventually returned to the fleet. 3 of its crew members were dead. The official explanation was engine trouble and severe weather conditions. But the surviving crew members, according to multiple second-hand accounts from people who spoke with them in the years that followed, described something very different. They described an encounter with something in the skies over Antarctica that none of them could explain, and that none of them, for the rest of their lives, were entirely willing to speak about on the record. Now, I want to be precise here, because this is exactly the kind of claim where intellectual honesty matters most. We do not have direct, verified testimony from those surviving crew members on this specific incident. What we have are second-hand accounts, researchers who claim to have spoken with veterans, fragments of correspondence, and the anomaly of the unusually high classification level applied to that particular incident report. That is not proof of anything extraordinary. It is, however, a pattern. And patterns matter. Because when you line up all the aircraft incidents from Operation Highjump, when you look at the total number of losses and the total number of incidents described in even the partial records that have been declassified, a picture emerges that is difficult to explain purely through the lens of weather and mechanical failure. The expedition lost aircraft at a rate that exceeded what even the most pessimistic pre-mission planning had anticipated. But the aircraft losses, as disturbing as they were not what ultimately drove the decision to end the mission early. That decision, according to the official record, was made in late February of 1947, approximately 8 weeks after the main body of the fleet had begun operations. The stated reason was deteriorating weather conditions and the need to depart before the Antarctic winter set in and made a safe return impossible. This is a reasonable explanation on its face. Antarctic winters are not merely unpleasant, they are lethal. The window for safe ship operations in Antarctic waters is narrow. Any commander planning a summer expedition knows that there is a hard deadline, an absolute point beyond which staying becomes suicidal. But here is the problem with the weather explanation. The expedition had planned for 8 months of operations. That planning had been done by people who understood Antarctic weather as well as anyone in the world. The supply loadout, the fuel calculations, the personnel deployment, all of it had been calibrated for an 8-month mission. The window for that mission, properly planned, should have extended well into the Antarctic autumn. So if it was not simply weather, what was it? That question hung over the expedition like the permanent Antarctic. It hung over the debriefings in Washington. It hung over the classified reports that were locked away in military archives. It hung over Byrd's extraordinary interview in Chile. And it has hung over every serious researcher who has looked at this episode in the nearly 8 decades since. The fleet came home. The men came home. But something had happened out there on the ice. Something that changed the calculus of the mission. Something that made 8 months feel like too long. Something that made 8 weeks feel like exactly as long as they could safely stay. And in the weeks and months after the expedition returned to American soil, the pieces of that something began to surface in fragments, in classified documents, in private conversations, in the careful, guarded words of men who had seen something they had not expected to see. Something that, if the accounts are even partially accurate, should have changed everything we thought we knew about what lives in the most remote place on Earth. What exactly happened in those final weeks on the ice is where this story gets truly extraordinary. The incidents nobody was supposed to talk about. Late January 1947. The Antarctic summer is at its peak. The sun hangs low on the horizon around the clock, casting that strange, flat light that veterans of polar operations describe as simultaneously beautiful and deeply disorienting. The fleet is spread across hundreds of miles of Antarctic coastline. Aircraft are flying daily reconnaissance and mapping missions. Radio communications are flowing between the 3 operational groups and the command ship, USS Mount Olympus. On paper, the operation is proceeding. But in the logs, in the private correspondence, in the fragments of declassified communications that researchers have assembled over decades, a different picture is beginning to form. Something is wrong, and nobody is quite sure what it is. Let us start with the aircraft incidents, because they form the most documentable thread in this story. The official record of Operation Highjump acknowledges the loss of 3 aircraft during the expedition. 3 men died. The causes listed are weather and mechanical failure. These are the numbers that appear in the sanitized summary reports that were eventually made available to the public. But researchers who have dug deeper into the partial declassification of expedition materials have noted a discrepancy. The number of incident reports, the internal communications about aircraft emergencies, damaged equipment, and unexplained navigational anomalies does not match the clean official summary. There are more incidents than 3. How many more is genuinely difficult to establish from the public record. But the pattern of the incidents themselves is where things become interesting. The most documented and most analyzed of the aircraft incidents involves a Martin PBM Mariner flying boat from the Eastern Group operating out of the USS Pine Island in the waters off the Thurston Peninsula on the western side of the Antarctic Peninsula. On the 9th of January, 1947, Aircraft Commander Lieutenant Commander David Bunger was on a routine coastal mapping flight when he made a discovery so unexpected that it generated its own classified report and its own layer of historical mystery. But before we get to what Bunger found, we need to talk about what happened to a different aircraft from the same group just days earlier. The Pine Island Group had been experiencing difficulties from the beginning of operations. The weather in the Amundsen Sea region, where the Eastern Group was operating, was particularly severe. Visibility dropped without warning. Ice conditions made navigation. The flying boats were operating at the extreme edge of their range, and the sea states made water landings and takeoffs genuinely dangerous. On the 6th of January, a Mariner flying boat designated George 1 was conducting a mapping flight approximately 300 miles from the Pine Island. The crew of 9 had been airborne for several hours. Weather conditions were reported as acceptable at departure. What happened next exists in two versions. The official version states that the aircraft encountered severe icing conditions, suffered engine difficulties, and crashed. 3 crew members, Warrant Officer Wendell Henderson, Ensign Maxwell Lopez, and Aviation Machinist's Mate First Class Frederick Williams, died in the incident. The surviving crew members were eventually recovered. That is the official version. The other version comes from fragments, from researchers who claim to have accessed materials beyond the standard declassified record, from veterans who spoke in private settings, from a Chilean naval officer named Augusto Orrego, who was present as an observer during parts of the expedition and who gave an interview decades later in which he described a very different atmosphere aboard the fleet during this period. Orrego described the American personnel as visibly shaken after certain incidents. He described a communication blackout imposed by the American command that went beyond what standard operational security would require. He described seeing damage on returning aircraft that did not match the official explanations he was given. He was, it must be said, one observer, speaking decades after the fact. His testimony is not proof, but he was there. The incident that has generated the most sustained analysis over the decades is not the George 1 crash. It is what multiple witnesses described as an encounter in the skies over the Antarctic. The accounts vary in detail, which is to be expected from second-hand and third-hand sources gathered over many years. But the core elements appear with enough consistency across enough independent sources that they cannot be entirely dismissed as fabrication or embellishment. Multiple aircraft crews, operating in different sectors of the Antarctic coastline, reported seeing objects in the sky that they could not identify and could not explain. Not at the same time, not in the same location, but across a period of several weeks, beginning in early January and continuing through February. Pilots and crew members reported encounters with aerial phenomena that did not match any known aircraft of any known nation. The objects were described in various accounts as disc-shaped or spherical. They moved at speeds that no aircraft of that era could achieve. They appeared and disappeared without the gradual approach and departure of a conventional aircraft. In several accounts, they were described as appearing suddenly from below the water surface or from beneath the ice. Now, I need to stop here and be absolutely clear about the epistemological status of these claims. We are dealing with second-hand accounts, some of them gathered decades after the fact. We are dealing with sources that range from credible observers with documented credentials to anonymous claims that cannot be verified at all. We are dealing with a subject, unexplained aerial phenomena, that has attracted an enormous amount of mythology, hoax, and wishful thinking over the decades. The intellectually honest position is this: these accounts cannot be verified to the standard of proof that serious historical analysis requires. They are data points, not evidence. They are questions, not answers. But here is what makes them impossible to simply ignore. They are consistent with a pattern that appears across multiple independent sources. They are consistent with the behavior of the American command during and after the expedition, specifically the classification decisions, the early termination, and the unusual public statements by Byrd. And they are consistent with a broader pattern of unexplained aerial phenomenon reports from the Antarctic region that continues to the present day. Consistency across independent sources is not proof, but it is significant. There is a specific name that appears repeatedly in the accounts of the more anomalous incidents, a name that carries particular weight because of the man attached to it: Lieutenant John Sayerson. Sayerson was a pilot with the Eastern Group. He flew multiple missions out of the Pine Island, and according to accounts that surfaced in the years following the expedition, he was one of the pilots who had a direct encounter with something that the official record does not acknowledge. The problem with the Sayerson accounts is that they exist primarily through intermediaries. Researchers who claim to have corresponded with him, accounts attributed to people who knew him. There is no single verified, direct, on-the-record testimony from Sayerson himself that matches the extraordinary claims made in his name. What does exist is documentation that Sayerson was debriefed extensively after the expedition, more extensively than would be expected for a routine mapping mission, and that he was instructed not to discuss certain aspects of his operational experience. That is documented. What he was told not to discuss is not. Let us turn to something that is unambiguously documented and that raises its own profound questions. On the 9th of January, 1947, Lieutenant Commander David Bunger was flying a mapping mission over the Antarctic coast near the Shackleton Ice Shelf in eastern Antarctica. What he found that day became known almost immediately as Bunger's Oasis, and it generated a classified report before it eventually became one of the most discussed geographical discoveries of the expedition. Bunger found a lake, not an ice lake, not a frozen surface, an open, liquid water lake in Antarctica with what he described as warm water and a surrounding area largely free of ice. He was so astonished that he landed his flying boat on the lake to confirm what he was seeing. He was right. The water was warm. The area, roughly 300 square kilometers, was an oasis in the ice. Biological samples collected from the lake showed microbial life. The surrounding rock, exposed above the ice line, showed evidence of plant life. In Antarctica, in January, with temperatures outside the oasis that were lethally cold. Bunger's Oasis is real. It has been revisited and studied by subsequent expeditions. The scientific explanation involves the geology of the region, the particular way that solar radiation interacts with dark rock surfaces, and the local thermal dynamics that can create isolated pockets of above-freezing temperatures even in an environment of extreme cold. That explanation is credible and is accepted by Antarctic science. But here is what is interesting about Bunger's Oasis in the context of Operation Highjump. The discovery was classified. An open liquid water lake in Antarctica, a discovery of enormous scientific significance, was classified by the United States military for a period of time before it was eventually allowed to enter the public scientific record. Why would you classify a lake? The answer given in later years was essentially that the military was cautious about releasing any geographic information from the expedition before a thorough review. That is a bureaucratic explanation that is technically plausible. But researchers have noted that the classification of Bunger's Oasis was part of a broader pattern in which the geographic discoveries of Operation Highjump were held back from the public scientific community for far longer than simple bureaucratic caution would require. The maps generated by the expedition, covering enormous stretches of previously uncharted Antarctic coastline, were not made fully available to international scientific bodies for years. Some portions of the photographic record have never been released at all. What is on those photographs? The question of the photographs is perhaps the most tantalizing unsolved element of the entire Operation Highjump story. The aerial photography program was one of the central objectives of the mission. The aircraft flew thousands of hours of mapping flights. The cameras were running almost continuously. By the time the fleet departed Antarctica in late February, the expedition had generated an enormous photographic archive covering a substantial portion of the Antarctic coastline and some interior regions. That archive went to Washington. Researchers who have attempted to access the full photographic record through Freedom of Information Act requests and other mechanisms have consistently encountered the same response. Large portions of the archive remain classified or have been listed as damaged, missing, or transferred to other agencies. In 1947, aerial photographs of ice and rock still classified. The expedition's communications tell their own story. In the final weeks of January and throughout February of 1947, the radio traffic between the operational groups and the command ship USS Mount Olympus shows a pattern that communication analysts have described as consistent with an operation dealing with unexpected and serious challenges. The frequency of communications increases. The content becomes more terse and more heavily encoded. There are references to incidents that are described only in the most oblique terms, with details relegated to classified appendices that have not been made public. And there is a moment, in early February, when the communications traffic shows something that looks very much like a command decision being made rapidly and at the highest level of the expedition's authority. A decision that changed the mission. A decision that sent 5,000 men home 2 months ahead of schedule. Whatever happened in those first 2 weeks of February 1947, it happened fast. And it happened with enough force and enough certainty to override the enormous logistical and strategic investment that the United States military had made in this operation. The men started packing. Not slowly, not methodically, the way you pack when you have planned your departure for weeks. Fast. Equipment that had been carefully deployed was retrieved with urgency. Supplies that had been intended for months of use were loaded back onto ships. Aircraft that were operational were stowed. Aircraft that were damaged were, in some cases, left behind. Left behind. On a mission with a budget in the billions, with equipment that represented enormous military value, certain items were abandoned rather than recovered. That does not happen in a planned, orderly withdrawal. That happens when you are leaving in a hurry. By late February of 1947, the fleet was heading north. Back through the pack ice. Back through the Southern Ocean. Back toward civilization. Toward warmth. Toward a world where the sun set and rose on a normal schedule, and the silence was not absolute, and the sky did not do things that experienced pilots could not explain. The men were quiet, by most accounts. Not the quiet of men who had completed a successful mission and were tired. A different quiet. The quiet of men who had seen something that they did not have words for. Something that their training had not prepared them for. Something that sat at the edge of their understanding and refused to resolve itself into any of the categories that their experience of the world had given them. Some of them would talk about it later, in fragments, in private, in the careful half-sentences of people who are not sure they will be believed. Some of them never talked about it at all. And in Washington, the debriefings began. The classification orders were issued. The photographs were locked away. The reports were filed in vaults, and the official story was assembled. Carefully, deliberately, with all the rough edges smoothed away and all the inexplicable incidents folded into the clean, acceptable language of weather and mechanical failure and the natural hazards of extreme environment operations. It was a good story. It was almost believable. Almost. What the official record refuses to explain. Washington, D.C., spring of 1947. The fleet has returned. The men are home. The debriefings are underway in secure facilities across the capital, and in the offices of the Navy Department and the newly forming structures of what would become the Central Intelligence Agency, very serious people are having very quiet conversations about what to do with what Operation Highjump has produced. Not the maps, not the scientific data, not the geographical discoveries, the other things, the things that do not fit. To understand what the official record refuses to explain, you first have to understand how official records are constructed. A military after-action report is not a diary. It is not an honest accounting of everything that happened. It is a document with a purpose, and that purpose is to present the operation in the most coherent, defensible, and strategically useful framework. Anomalies that cannot be explained are either omitted, reduced to the blandest possible language, or classified at a level that removes them from the main body of the record entirely. This is not conspiracy. This is bureaucracy. This is how institutions protect themselves from questions they cannot answer. But the consequence is a document that, when examined carefully, contains visible seams, places where the official narrative strains against something that will not quite fit inside it. Places where the language becomes unusually vague, precisely at the points where you most want specificity. Places where the chronology develops gaps that subsequent researchers have spent decades trying to fill. Operation Highjump's official record is full of those seams. Let us start with the most basic anomaly, the one that every serious researcher notices immediately, and that the official record has never satisfactorily resolved. The timeline. The expedition was planned for 8 months. The planning documents, the supply manifests, the personnel deployment schedules, all of it is calibrated for a mission running from December of 1946 through approximately August of 1947. The Antarctic summer runs from November through March. An 8-month mission would therefore have extended deep into the Antarctic winter, which means the planning assumed that at least some component of the operation would continue through the most hostile environmental conditions the continent can produce. That is not a casual decision. That requires specialized equipment, specialized training, specialized logistics, all of which the expedition had. They left in late February. The Antarctic summer was not yet over. The weather window was not yet closed. The ice conditions, while deteriorating, had not yet reached the point where operations were. The official explanation, as stated in the summary report, cites deteriorating weather conditions and the need to preserve the safety of the fleet. But here is what that explanation does not address. If weather was the reason for departure, why were the weather conditions in February of 1947 significantly worse than the planning assumptions for a mission that had always intended to operate through the Antarctic winter? And why, if weather was the issue, was the decision to depart made so suddenly, without the gradual scaling back of operations that you would expect from a command preparing for an orderly, weather-driven withdrawal? The departure was not gradual. It was abrupt. The second anomaly in the official record concerns the casualty figures. 3 men are officially listed as killed during Operation Highjump. 3. For an expedition of nearly 5,000 personnel, operating in one of the most dangerous environments on Earth for 8 weeks, with 23 aircraft conducting thousands of hours of flight operations, that number is, in a peculiar way, both too low and too complicated. Too low because the operational tempo of the expedition, the sheer volume of flying hours in Antarctic conditions, would statistically be expected to produce a higher casualty rate based on the accident records of comparable operations. Too complicated because several researchers have identified discrepancies between the official casualty list and the personnel records of individuals who were part of the expedition and whose subsequent service records contain anomalies suggesting their operational experience was more significant than the official record acknowledges. This is difficult territory. Personnel records are among the most sensitive and most protected categories of military documentation. Full access is rarely possible. And claims about what personnel records do or do not contain, made by researchers who have had partial or indirect access, must be treated with appropriate caution. But the pattern is there, and patterns in official records do not appear by accident. The third anomaly is the one that, in many ways, is the hardest to dismiss because it involves not what the official record omits, but what it actually says. The official report of Operation Highjump, in its summary conclusions, states that the expedition successfully mapped approximately 60% of the Antarctic coastline and gathered significant scientific data that would inform future polar operations. 60%. After 8 weeks of operations by 23 aircraft flying daily missions across thousands of miles of coastline. Now here is the question that this raises. What about the other 40%? If the mission objective was to map the Antarctic coastline, and the expedition had 23 aircraft and 5,000 personnel, and was planning to operate for 8 months, what happened to the 40% of the coastline that was not mapped? The official answer is time and weather constraints. But that answer only works if you accept the premise that the expedition ran out of time due to weather. And we have already established that the timeline of departure does not support a simple weather explanation. So here is an alternative framing. The expedition did not fail to map 40% of the Antarctic coastline because it ran out of time. The expedition left before completing its mapping because something else happened that made completing the mapping impossible, or irrelevant, or unsafe. And whatever that something was, it happened in the interior regions and coastal sections that remain, to this day, the least thoroughly documented parts of the Antarctic record from that expedition. The fourth anomaly is perhaps the most intriguing from a purely documentary standpoint. In 1955, a German researcher named Matthias Schauberger working through contacts in the post-war scientific community, published an analysis of the publicly available data from Operation Highjump, alongside comparative data from earlier Antarctic expeditions. His analysis identified a series of magnetic anomaly readings recorded by the expedition's instruments that did not match the established geomagnetic models for the Antarctic region. Schauberger's work was not widely circulated. It appeared in a small circulation scientific journal and was not picked up by the mainstream scientific press. But it was noticed by certain researchers, and according to documentary evidence that surfaced decades later, it was noticed by certain government agencies as well. The magnetic anomalies that Schauberger identified were concentrated in two specific regions of Antarctica. One was in the interior of the continent, in the general vicinity of what is now known as the East Antarctic Plateau. The other was in the coastal region of what is now called Marie Byrd Land, named after the admiral's wife, in the area that had been most intensively surveyed by the western group of the expedition. Geomagnetic anomalies in Antarctica are not in themselves unusual. The continent's geological structure produces magnetic variations that complicate navigation and confound simple models. This is well-established science. But the anomalies Schauberger identified were of a different character. They were localized in ways that geological structure alone did not fully explain. They were intense in ways that exceeded the range of normal geological variation. And they were, in at least two cases, associated with areas where the expedition's aircraft had reported the most significant operational difficulties. Schauberger cautiously suggested that the anomalies might indicate subsurface geological features of unusual character. He did not speculate beyond that. Other researchers, less cautious, have speculated considerably further. Let us talk about those other researchers. Because the story of how Operation Highjump has been analyzed and interpreted over the decades is itself a fascinating and complicated narrative. On one side of the spectrum, you have mainstream historians and military analysts who accept the broad outline of the official record, acknowledge that the expedition produced genuine scientific results, and attribute the early departure and classification decisions to a combination of legitimate operational difficulties and Cold War security concerns. The Soviet Union was the enemy. Antarctica was strategically important. Classifying geographic data made sense in that context. This is a coherent position. It is not unreasonable. On the other side of the spectrum, you have a vast ecosystem of conspiracy theories that have grown up around Operation Highjump over the decades. Nazi bases in Antarctica, secret underground civilizations, alien technology, a war between American forces and non-human adversaries. These theories have circulated in books, documentaries, and online communities for decades, and they have a devoted following. These theories are not supported by verifiable evidence. They are, in many cases, built on misrepresented sources, fabricated documents, and a chain of inference so extended that it loses all connection to the original historical record. I am not going to pretend otherwise. But here is the uncomfortable truth that sits between those two positions. The mainstream explanation does not fully account for all of the anomalies in the record. And the conspiracy theories, while unverified, did not emerge from nothing. They emerged from genuine gaps in the official record, genuine inconsistencies in the timeline, genuine, unexplained elements in the testimony of participants. The gap between what the official record says and what actually happened is real. What filled that gap is the question. The Nazi-Antarctica connection deserves specific attention, not because it is proven, but because it is historically grounded in ways that most people do not realize. In the late 1930s, Nazi Germany conducted its own Antarctic expedition. In January and February of 1939, the German vessel Schwabenland, operated by the Lufthansa airline under naval commission, conducted an aerial survey of a large section of Antarctic territory. The Germans flew dozens of missions over a region of Antarctica they named New Schwabenland, dropping metal markers to establish a territorial claim. This expedition is documented. It is historical fact. What is also historical fact is that the Nazi regime had a serious interest in Antarctica that went beyond mere territorial flag planting. The SS, under Heinrich Himmler, ran a research program called the Ahnenerbe that investigated, among many other things, the potential of extreme polar regions as locations for hidden bases or facilities. What is also historical fact is that after the war, Allied forces discovered that the Germans had been conducting significantly more logistical activity in the South Atlantic than had previously been understood, including submarine operations in waters that would have been consistent with Antarctic supply runs. These are facts. They are documented. What is not documented, what has never been verified despite decades of searching by serious researchers, is any evidence of a functioning Nazi base in Antarctica during or after the war. No physical evidence. No credible eyewitness testimony. No documentation from the vast archive of captured Nazi records that were analyzed after the war. The Nazi Antarctica base theory is almost certainly a myth. But the documented history of German interest in the continent raises a legitimate question. When the United States sent 5,000 soldiers to Antarctica in 1946, one of the things they may genuinely have been looking for was evidence of German wartime activity. Not a secret base, perhaps, but supply caches, navigation infrastructure, submarine servicing facilities, the kind of logistical support network that would have allowed German submarines to extend their operations in the South Atlantic. That is a classified mission objective that would not have appeared in the public-facing summary of Operation Highjump. And finding such evidence, or failing to find it in the locations expected, or finding something else entirely in its place, would explain a great deal about the behavior of the expedition's command in those final weeks. There is a document that researchers have been arguing about for years. In 1947, a memorandum was reportedly prepared for the Joint Chiefs of Staff summarizing the findings of Operation Highjump at the highest classification level. This document has never been officially released. Its existence is known through references in other declassified materials and through the accounts of researchers who claim to have seen portions of it. What the document reportedly contained is, obviously, impossible to verify with certainty. But researchers who claim familiarity with its contents describe a summary that diverges significantly from the public record in two specific areas. The first is the aircraft incident reports. The document reportedly contains a more complete account of the aerial incidents during the expedition, including incidents that were entirely omitted from the public. The second is a section dealing with what the document apparently described as unidentified aerial phenomena encountered during the expedition, documented by multiple crews, assessed as representing technology of unknown origin. Technology of unknown origin. In a classified memorandum to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1947, the same year that Kenneth Arnold made his famous observation of unidentified flying objects over Mount Rainier in Washington state on the 24th of June, introducing the term flying saucer to the American public. The same year that something crashed in the desert outside Roswell, New Mexico in early July, generating a military response so intense and a cover story so elaborate that it has fueled debate for nearly 8 decades. The same year that the United States government created the Central Intelligence Agency in September, specifically to centralize the collection and analysis of intelligence that crossed the boundaries of existing agencies. The same year that the National Security Act reorganized the entire American military and intelligence apparatus. All of this in 1947. The year that 5,000 American soldiers went to Antarctica and came home 8 weeks early. Coincidences are the raw material of conspiracy theories. I know that. And I am not suggesting that the temporal clustering of these events in 1947 proves any particular connection between them. But I am suggesting that 1947 was a year in which the United States government was confronting something that did not fit its existing frameworks, something that required the creation of new institutions, new classification systems, new ways of managing information that the public was not to have access to. Whether Operation Highjump was part of that larger confrontation, whether it was connected to the events at Roswell and over Mount Rainier, whether it represented an early chapter in a story that is still being written, these are questions that the official record does not answer. They are questions that the official record seems specifically designed not to answer. And that, perhaps more than any single anomaly or unexplained incident, is what makes the story of Operation Highjump so enduringly and so uncomfortably fascinating. 5,000 men went to the bottom of the world. The official record tells us almost nothing about what they found. And somewhere in the locked archives of the American military establishment, the full story waits. The world that hid beneath the ice. Before we can go any further into what Operation Highjump encountered, we need to do something that most tellings of this story skip entirely. We need to understand what Antarctica actually is. Not the postcard version, not the Penguin documentary version, the real version, the geological, geophysical, and scientific version. Because the more you understand about what is genuinely, verifiably, scientifically known about Antarctica, the more the questions raised by Operation Highjump refuse to go away. The reality of Antarctica is, in many respects, stranger than the myths. Antarctica has not always been where it is. This is not a fringe claim. This is established plate tectonics, taught in university geology courses around the world. Approximately 100 million years ago, the landmass we now call Antarctica was part of the supercontinent Gondwana, positioned significantly further north in a temperate climate zone. It was covered in forests. It was home to dinosaurs. Its rivers ran to warm seas. The fossil record from Antarctica is extraordinary and has been accumulating for decades. Researchers from institutions including the British Antarctic Survey and multiple American universities have recovered fossils of tropical plants, large reptiles, and even early mammal species from Antarctic rock formations. A study published in Nature in 2019 described the discovery of fossil forests in Antarctica, showing trees that had survived in near-polar conditions, suggesting a climate dramatically warmer than anything the continent has experienced in millions of years. Antarctica began drifting south approximately 80 million years ago. The cooling accelerated approximately 34 million years ago, when the Drake Passage opened between Antarctica and South America, creating the circumpolar current that isolated the continent thermally and drove the formation of the ice sheet we know today. The ice sheet itself is between 15 million and 34 million years old in its oldest sections, which means that beneath that ice, sealed away from the surface for millions of years, is a landscape that has not seen sunlight since before humans existed, since before our primate ancestors existed, since before most of the mammals we share the planet with had evolved. That hidden landscape is extraordinary. Modern ice-penetrating radar surveys conducted by research programs including the British Antarctic Survey's BedMap project, NASA's Operation Icebridge, and the multinational SCAR Scientific Consortium have produced increasingly detailed images of the subglacial topography of Antarctica. What those images reveal is a continent of startling geological diversity and complexity. The Trans-Antarctic Mountains, which divide the continent into East and West Antarctica, are among the longest mountain ranges on Earth, extending approximately 3,500 kilometers. Their peaks rise to nearly 5 kilometers above sea level. They were unknown to science until explorers reached the continent in the 19th century. Beneath the ice of East Antarctica lies the Gamburtsev mountain range, a mountain chain comparable in size to the European Alps, located entirely beneath the ice sheet and invisible from the surface. The Gamburtsevs were only confirmed through seismic surveys in the 1950s and have been studied intensively in subsequent decades. How a mountain range of that size formed in the interior of a continent and then became entirely buried under ice is a question that Antarctic geologists are still working to fully answer. There are lakes, many lakes, not frozen lakes, liquid lakes, kept liquid by the geothermal heat rising from the bedrock below, insulated from the surface cold by kilometers of ice above them. These subglacial lakes are one of the most extraordinary discoveries in the history of Antarctic science. Lake Vostok is the largest and most studied of these subglacial lakes. It sits beneath approximately 4 kilometers of ice at the location of Russia's Vostok Station in East Antarctica, roughly coinciding with the South Geomagnetic Pole. Lake Vostok is not a small pond. It is approximately 250 kilometers long and 50 kilometers wide. Its maximum depth exceeds 900 meters. Its total volume of water is comparable to Lake Ontario in North America. It has been sealed from the surface for somewhere between 15 million and 25 million years. Russian scientists at Vostok Station drilled through the ice sheet over a period of decades, finally reaching the lake's surface in February of 2012. The drilling program was enormously controversial within the Antarctic scientific community because of concerns about contaminating a pristine environment that had been isolated for millions of years. The Russians proceeded anyway. What they found in the ice immediately above the lake's water surface, in what is called the accretion ice layer, where lake water freezes onto the bottom of the ice sheet, was extraordinary. Microbial life. Bacteria in the accretion ice, representing genetic lineages that had diverged from their nearest surface relatives by hundreds of millions of years. Not thousands, not millions. Hundreds of millions of years of isolated evolution in a dark, cold, pressurized lake beneath 4 kilometers of ice. A paper published in the journal PLOS ONE in 2013 by researchers from the State University of New York at Stony Brook analyzed the microbial DNA recovered from the Vostok accretion ice and identified over 3,500 unique genetic sequences, the majority of which could not be matched to any known organism in the global genetic database. Read that again. Over 3,500 genetic sequences, the majority unidentifiable. In a lake that has been sealed from the surface world for up to 25 million years. Lake Vostok is not the only subglacial lake. It is simply the largest and best studied. Current surveys estimate that there are approximately 400 subglacial lakes beneath the Antarctic ice sheet. They range in size from tiny ponds to bodies of water comparable to the Great Lakes of North America. Some of these lakes are connected to each other through a system of subglacial rivers and drainage channels. Water moves between lakes under the ice, driven by pressure differentials and thermal gradients. The subglacial hydrological system of Antarctica is, in the words of researchers at the Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge, one of the most complex and least understood hydrological systems on Earth. And it is almost entirely unexplored. The technology to properly explore these environments, remotely operated vehicles capable of operating in the extreme cold and pressure of subglacial lakes, has only been developed in the last 2 decades. The first successful deployment of such a vehicle in a subglacial lake occurred in January of 2019, when a British team successfully deployed a probe into subglacial Lake Mercer in West Antarctica as part of the SALSA project. The project was a collaboration between multiple American universities funded by the National Science Foundation. What they found confirmed the presence of microbial life, and it raised questions about what else might be found in the larger and deeper lakes that have not yet been reached. Now, I want to bring something into this discussion that is not fringe science and is not speculation. It is peer-reviewed research published in reputable journals, discussed openly in the Antarctic scientific community, and deeply strange. The geothermal heat flow beneath Antarctica is not uniform. In most of the continent, geothermal heat is modest, and its primary effect is to melt the very base of the ice sheet, contributing to the subglacial water system. But in certain regions, particularly in West Antarctica and in the area beneath the West Antarctic ice sheet, the geothermal heat flow is dramatically higher. A study published in Scientific Reports in 2017 by researchers from the University of Edinburgh used seismic data to identify a region beneath the West Antarctic ice sheet where the geothermal heat flux is among the highest recorded anywhere on Earth outside of active volcanic zones. The researchers attributed this to a mantle plume, a column of anomalously hot material rising from deep within the Earth beneath the ice. This mantle plume is driving significant melting at the base of the West Antarctic ice sheet. It is contributing to the instability of that ice sheet that concerns climate scientists so greatly. And it is creating, in the subglacial environment above it, conditions of warmth and liquid water that would be, in principle, hospitable to life. Hospitable to life. Beneath the ice of Antarctica. The Marie Byrd Land region sits directly above the area most strongly affected by this mantle plume. Marie Byrd Land, named after Richard Byrd's wife. The region that was the focus of the Western group of Operation Highjump. The region where the expedition's aircraft reported some of the most significant operational difficulties. the region where the magnetic anomaly readings documented by Matthias Schauberger in his 1955 analysis were concentrated. The same region where the University of Edinburgh's 2017 study identified the most intense geothermal activity in West Antarctica. Is this a connection? Is the geothermal anomaly beneath Marie Byrd Land related to the operational difficulties experienced by Operation Highjump? Is it related to the magnetic anomalies recorded in 1947? The honest answer is that we do not know. What we know is that the region is genuinely anomalous in multiple independent scientific measurements spanning nearly 80 years. That is not nothing. There is another aspect of Antarctic science that has been generating serious research attention for decades, and that speaks directly to the question of what might exist beneath the ice: acoustic anomalies. The Antarctic ice sheet is an extraordinarily effective medium for transmitting sound. Low-frequency acoustic waves, infrasound, travel through the ice and through the bedrock beneath it with remarkable efficiency over enormous distances. The continent is, in a sense, a giant acoustic. Researchers monitoring the Antarctic Seismic and Infrasound Network have documented, over decades of observation, a category of acoustic signals that do not match the signatures of earthquakes, volcanic activity, ice quakes caused by ice movement, or any other known natural phenomenon. These signals, sometimes called Antarctic anomalous acoustic events in the technical literature, have been documented by monitoring stations operated by institutions including the CTBTO, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, which maintains a global network of infrasound monitoring stations, including several in and around Antarctica. The CTBTO monitors are designed primarily to detect nuclear tests. They are extraordinarily sensitive instruments, capable of detecting very low-level acoustic events at distances of thousands of kilometers. And they have been detecting something in the Antarctic region that does not fit the standard categories. The official scientific literature describes these events cautiously, as anomalous signals of uncertain origin requiring further study. That is the careful language of researchers who have found something they cannot explain and are not yet ready to speculate about publicly. Let us now bring all of this back to 1947. The men of Operation Highjump arrived in Antarctica with instruments that were primitive by modern standards, but that were, for their time, state-of-the-art. They had magnetometers. They had sonar equipment. They had seismic monitoring capability. They had aerial cameras. They had radio direction finding equipment. And they were operating over a continent that, as modern science has now established, contains extraordinary anomalies in its magnetic field, its thermal profile, its subglacial topography, and its acoustic property. What would their instruments have told them? What would their pilots have seen flying at low altitude over a landscape where the geothermal heat is intense enough to melt ice from below, where magnetic anomalies are strong enough to affect compass navigation, where the subglacial environment conceals lake systems the size of small seas? We do not have access to their raw instrument data. That data was classified. But we can make reasonable inferences based on what we now know about the Antarctic environment. Their compasses would have behaved strangely over certain regions, particularly over Marie Byrd Land, where the combination of geomagnetic anomalies and high geothermal activity would have produced instrument readings that their training had not prepared them for. Their sonar equipment, if deployed through the ice or from aircraft over certain coastal regions, would have detected features beneath the ice that had no obvious explanation. Cavities, water bodies, topographic features that did not match any known geological model. Their cameras, flying over certain coastal regions, might have photographed features, geological features, topographic features, thermal features that were real, that were natural, but that looked like nothing any of them had seen before. And in the context of 1947, in the immediate aftermath of a war in which German technology had repeatedly produced things that seemed impossible until they were real, in a world where the atomic bomb had just demonstrated that reality was capable of exceeding any prior imagination, what would those men have made of what they were seeing? There is a scenario that fits all of the known facts of Operation Highjump without requiring any supernatural or extraterrestrial explanation. A scenario that is, in many ways, more unsettling than the more exotic theories precisely because it is so plausible. The expedition encountered the genuine strangeness of Antarctica, the magnetic anomalies, the geothermal features, the subglacial terrain, the acoustic phenomena, the atmospheric and electromagnetic effects that the polar environment produces and that no amount of briefing can fully prepare you for. And in the context of the time, in the context of the Cold War and the Nazi War and the Atomic Age, they interpreted what they found through a lens of strategic threat. They found things that looked, to military eyes trained to see threats, like evidence of capability, of presence, of something that should not be there. And they responded the way military commands respond when they find something they cannot categorize and cannot counter. They classified it. They came home, and they started building the institutional framework, the CIA, the NSA, the classified research programs, the UFO investigation units, that would allow them to quietly pursue the question of what they had found without having to explain it to the public. But there is a detail that this scenario, compelling as it is, does not fully explain. Byrd's warning. When Richard Byrd said that the United States needed to be prepared for defense against aircraft flying from pole to pole at incredible speeds, he was not describing a geological anomaly. He was not describing a magnetic anomaly. He was not describing a geothermal feature. He was describing aircraft. He was describing technology. He was describing something that moved through the sky. And he was saying, with the full weight of his reputation and his experience and his extraordinary career, that this was a threat. A man who had flown over both poles. A man who had spent more time in Antarctica than any living human. A man who had survived death alone under the ice. A man who had seen, in his long career, everything that aviation could produce. That man saw something over Antarctica in 1947 that he called aircraft, that he called a threat, that he said the United States needed to defend against. If the genuine strangeness of Antarctica can explain most of what happened during Operation Highjump, it cannot quite explain that. And that is where we are going next. The warning that Washington wanted to forget. March 1947. The fleet is making its way north through the Southern Ocean. The Antarctic coastline is falling behind. The men are tired, quiet, and in many cases deeply unsettled in ways they are struggling to articulate, even to themselves. The equipment is stowed. The classified materials are locked. The debriefings are being prepared. And Richard Byrd is giving an interview to a Chilean newspaper. This is the moment that changes everything about how we read Operation Highjump. Not the expedition itself, not the anomalies in the official record, not the classified photographs or the unexplained aircraft incidents. This moment. A 58-year-old rear admiral, one of the most decorated and credentialed military officers in American history, sitting down with a journalist from El Mercurio and saying things that his government had almost certainly not authorized him to say. The question is why? Let us reconstruct the context as precisely as the historical record allows. The fleet made a port call in Chilean waters during the return journey. This was standard procedure. The ships needed resupply. The men needed rest. Chile was a friendly nation with whom the United States maintained good diplomatic relations. A brief stop in Chilean ports was operationally logical and politically routine. What was not routine was Byrd's decision to speak to the press. Senior military officers on classified operations do not generally seek out journalists during port calls. They do not give interviews discussing the strategic implications of operations that are still in the process of being formally assessed and reported to their chain of command. They certainly do not make statements about military threats and defense vulnerabilities before those assessments have been reviewed, approved, and shaped by the institutional machinery of the Pentagon and the State Department. Byrd knew this. He had been a senior officer for decades. He understood the protocols. He spoke anyway. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The original Spanish was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The El Mercurio interview was published on the 5th of March, 1947. The original Spanish text has been analyzed by multiple researchers, and while translations vary slightly in their rendering of specific phrases, the core content is consistent across all serious translations. Byrd stated that the United States could not afford to lose another war. He spoke about the strategic importance of the polar regions. He described Antarctica as a continent of extraordinary strategic value that had not been adequately appreciated by American policymakers. And then he said it. He warned that in the event of a new conflict, America could be attacked by aircraft that would fly over one or both poles. He described these aircraft as capable of incredible speeds. He described the threat as one that existing American air defense infrastructure was not prepared to counter. The word he used in the Spanish original, according to researchers who have analyzed the text closely, carries a connotation of urgency and personal conviction that goes beyond standard strategic briefing language. This was not a calculated policy statement. This was a warning from a man who believed what he was saying with an intensity that was overriding his institutional caution. Now let us be precise about what he said and what he did not say. He did not say the aircraft were extraterrestrial. He did not say they came from beneath the ice. He did not describe their appearance. He did not name a country of origin. He did not describe a specific incident. He said aircraft. He said incredible speeds. He said pole to pole. He said threat. That is what the documented record contains. Everything else, the elaborate interpretations, the extraterrestrial narratives, the underground civilization theories, is inference built on top of those words. And inference, however compelling, is not evidence. But the words themselves are extraordinary enough without any additional interpretation. Because in March of 1947, no nation on Earth possessed aircraft capable of flying from pole to pole at incredible speeds. The most advanced jet aircraft in the world at that time was the American Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, which had entered service in the final months of the Second World War. Its maximum speed was approximately 880 kilometers per hour. Its combat range was approximately 1,300 kilometers. Flying from the South Pole to the North Pole, a distance of approximately 20,000 kilometers, was so far beyond its capability as to be essentially meaningless as a tactical scenario. The Soviet Union's most advanced aircraft at that time were derivatives of wartime designs. German jet technology had been captured and was being studied, but operational aircraft of any extraordinary capability were years away. The first Soviet jet fighter, the Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-9, had only just made its first flight in April of 1946, and it was no more capable than its American counterparts. Britain, France, Germany, Japan, all were rebuilding from the devastation of the war. None possessed technology that remotely matched what Byrd was describing. So who was he warning about? There are three serious answers to that question. Not the fringe answers. The three answers that serious analysts, working within the constraints of verifiable evidence, have proposed over the decades. The first answer is strategic projection. Byrd was not describing a current threat. He was describing a future threat, extrapolating from the trajectory of technological development to a scenario he believed would materialize within years or decades. The Soviet Union was developing long-range aviation capability. The polar route was the shortest path between the Soviet Union and the continental United States. A warning about polar air attack was therefore a warning about where Cold War military planning needed to focus. This interpretation is coherent and has been adopted by many mainstream historians. It fits the documented geopolitical context of early 1947. And it has some predictive validity because the polar air threat did indeed become a central preoccupation of American defense planning in the 1950s, driving the construction of the DEW line and the establishment of NORAD. But this interpretation has a problem. If Byrd was simply making a conventional strategic assessment about Soviet long-range aviation, why was it treated as extraordinary? Why was his statement not amplified by the American defense establishment as a useful public argument for increased defense spending? Why, instead, was it received with a silence that several of Byrd's contemporaries described as pointed and deliberate? Strategic assessments that serve institutional interests get publicized. Strategic assessments that create institutional discomfort get buried. Byrd's warning got buried. The second answer is the German remnant theory. At the end of the Second World War, the full accounting of German military assets was incomplete. Significant numbers of German submarines were unaccounted for. Senior Nazi figures, including scientists and engineers with access to advanced weapons programs, had disappeared in the chaos of the war's final weeks. The rat lines, the escape networks that moved Nazi personnel to South America and elsewhere, were real and documented. Among the things that were unaccounted for was a significant portion of the research conducted under the Nazi advanced weapons programs. The V-2 rocket program is well known. Less well known are the various aircraft development programs that were running in parallel, some of which were pursuing propulsion and aerodynamic concepts that were genuinely ahead of conventional aviation development. The theory holds that some component of this advanced German research, along with the personnel who conducted it and the resources needed to continue it, made its way to Antarctica in the final stages of the war or immediately afterward. That Byrd's expedition was sent specifically to locate and assess this remnant capability, and that what they found was more advanced and more threatening than they had anticipated. This theory has the advantage of explaining the military composition of Operation Highjump, the submarines, the aircraft carrier, the firepower, in a way that a pure scientific expedition does not require. It explains the urgency of the departure, and it explains why Byrd's warning, framed as a threat from an unspecified enemy, was treated with such institutional sensitivity. The problem with this theory is evidence. The evidence for a functioning Nazi Antarctic base, as discussed in the previous chapter, does not exist in verifiable form. German submarine activity in the South Atlantic during and after the war is documented, but the leap from South Atlantic submarine operations to a functioning Antarctic installation capable of producing aircraft of extraordinary speed is enormous and unsupported. The theory is possible in a narrow technical sense. It is not supported. The third answer is the one that the official record most strenuously avoids. That Operation Highjump encountered technology that was not German, not Soviet, not American, not the product of any known human program. That what the expedition found in the skies and possibly the waters of Antarctica was something that had not been built by any of the powers contending for global dominance in 1947. This is the answer that generates the most resistance from serious analysts, for obvious and legitimate reasons. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The evidentiary standard for a claim of this magnitude is extraordinarily high, and the evidence available does not meet that standard. But here is what I want to sit with for a moment. Richard Byrd had seen everything that human aviation could produce in his lifetime. He had flown experimental aircraft. He had navigated by the stars over both poles. He had watched aviation transform from fragile canvas biplanes to jet-powered fighters in the span of his career. He knew what human technology looked like from the air and from the cockpit. When he described aircraft capable of flying from pole to pole at incredible speeds, he was not describing something he thought might be possible with a few more years of Soviet development. He was describing something he had encountered, something that had impressed him enough, or frightened him enough, to override his institutional loyalty and his officers' discipline and his lifelong caution with the press. A man who has spent his career in the air does not warn about fictional aircraft. The reaction of the American government to Byrd's interview deserves as much attention as the interview itself. There was no official response, no clarification, no denial, no context provided. The statement was not amplified, not addressed, not incorporated into any public defense policy discussion. It was ignored. In the way that governments ignore things that they do not know how to handle. Several of Byrd's contemporaries, officers and officials who were part of the institutional world in Washington in 1947, gave accounts in later years that described a very specific reaction to the El Mercurio interview in the halls of the Pentagon and the State Department. Concern. Not about the strategic content, not about the policy implications. Concern about the fact that Byrd had spoken at all. There were, according to these accounts, conversations at senior levels about whether Byrd had violated operational security, about whether the expedition's classification protocols had been followed, about what else he might say, and to whom. These conversations, if they occurred as described, are not the conversations of a government reacting to a retired admiral making an eccentric strategic prediction. They are the conversations of a government reacting to someone who has said more than they were supposed to say. Byrd returned to the United States and was debriefed extensively. The debriefings were conducted at a classification level that meant their contents were known to only a handful of senior officials. He was not publicly disciplined for the El Mercurio interview. He was not stripped of rank or position. He continued to be treated with the institutional respect that his extraordinary career had earned. But he was watched. And in the years that followed, as the Cold War deepened and the American national security apparatus expanded and calcified around its secrets, Byrd became a more careful public figure. His subsequent statements about Antarctica were measured. His public references to Operation Highjump were minimal. The urgent, personal quality of the El Mercurio interview never quite appeared again in his public persona. He had said what he needed to say. Perhaps he had been told that was enough. Perhaps he had decided for himself that nothing further could be safely said. Either way, the warning stood, unaddressed, unexplained. A data point that the official history of 1947 absorbed without processing, the way a body absorbs a splinter, surrounding it with scar tissue rather than extracting it. There is a postscript to the Byrd warning story that is less well known, but in some ways more significant. In 1954, Byrd gave a lecture at a private gathering of senior American officials and military officers. The exact nature of the gathering, its composition, and its sponsoring organization is not fully clear from the available record. But the substance of what Byrd said at that lecture was described by at least 2 attendees in accounts that surfaced years later. He returned to the theme of the polar threat, but in this private setting, away from journalists and public scrutiny, his language was reportedly less guarded than it had been in the El Mercurio interview 7 years earlier. He reportedly described what he had seen over Antarctica not as a projected future threat, but as a present reality. He reportedly described the objects his crews had encountered as operating in ways that no known propulsion system could explain. And he reportedly expressed, in the careful language of a man who has spent a lifetime in the company of serious people and knows how to be taken seriously, a conviction that the American government's response to what had been found in Antarctica was inadequate, that it was treating an extraordinary problem as if it were an ordinary, that the implications of what Operation Highjump had encountered had not been fully processed by the institutional machinery that was supposed to protect the United States from existential threats. These are second-hand accounts of a private lecture that occurred over 70 years ago. Their verifiability is limited, but they are consistent with everything else we know about Richard Byrd, consistent with the El Mercurio interview, consistent with his later descriptions of Antarctica as a land of perpetual mystery, consistent with the behavior of a man who had seen something that his world was not yet ready to understand, and was spending his remaining years trying to find ways to say so without being dismissed or silenced. Richard Byrd died on the 11th of March, 1957. He was 68 years old. His health had been declining for several years, a decline that some who knew him attributed in part to the psychological weight of what he carried from his Antarctic experiences. That attribution is impossible to verify, and perhaps too convenient. What is not impossible to verify is what he left behind. A warning, documented, published, in a Chilean newspaper in March of 1947. A warning that has never been officially addressed by the government that sent him to Antarctica. A warning that has never been explained by the institution that classified his expedition's findings. A warning from the most credentialed Antarctic explorer in American history that something in the skies over the most remote place on Earth was flying at speeds no human technology of that era could match. That warning is still out there, still waiting for an answer. And the answer, if it exists, is almost certainly sitting in a vault somewhere in the American national security apparatus, surrounded by the classification markings of an era that has long since passed, but whose secrets have never been released. In the chapters that remain, we are going to follow the thread of what happened after Highjump, what the United States did next in Antarctica, what the international community eventually decided to do about a continent that was clearly more significant than anyone was publicly admitting, and what modern science and modern surveillance technology have been quietly finding in the decades since 5,000 soldiers came home from the ice and a rear admiral gave a warning that nobody in power wanted to hear. The year everything changed. Let us step back from Antarctica for a moment. Let us look at the full picture of 1947. Because when you lay out everything that happened in that single year, not just Operation Highjump, not just the El Mercurio interview, but everything, a pattern emerges that is difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence. A pattern that suggests the United States government in 1947 was not dealing with one anomalous event. It was dealing with a category of anomalous events, a new kind of problem that its existing institutional framework was not equipped to handle. and its response to that problem reshaped the American national security apparatus in ways that are still with us today. January of 1947. Operation Highjump is in full swing. The fleet is operating in Antarctic waters. Aircraft are flying daily missions. The incidents we discussed in previous chapters are beginning to accumulate. The command atmosphere aboard the USS Mount Olympus is, according to the accounts we have examined, increasingly tense. At the same time, in Washington, the post-war reorganization of the American military and intelligence community is in its final stages of planning. The National Security Act, which will transform the American government's capacity to manage secrets, is being drafted. The conversations happening in the corridors of the Pentagon and the State Department are about architecture, about how to build institutions capable of handling threats and information of a kind that the existing framework was not designed for. The timing of that institutional redesign, concurrent with Operation Highjump, is worth holding in mind. June 24, 1947. A civilian pilot named Kenneth Arnold is flying his small private aircraft near Mount Rainier in Washington State. He is an experienced pilot, a businessman, not given to fantasy or attention-seeking. He is searching for a downed military transport aircraft when he observes something that he cannot explain. 9 objects flying in formation near Mount Rainier, moving at a speed he estimates at approximately 2,700 kilometers per hour, nearly 3 times faster than any aircraft in existence. Moving with a skipping motion, like saucers skimming across water. Arnold reports what he saw to aviation authorities. His account is taken seriously. He is interviewed extensively. He is not dismissed as a crank. The military investigates, and the term flying saucer enters the American vocabulary. Arnold's sighting is not an isolated report. In the weeks that follow, hundreds of similar reports pour in from across the United States. Pilots, military personnel, police officers, ordinary citizens, all describing objects in the sky that move with capabilities no known aircraft possesses. The military's internal response to this flood of reports is, according to subsequently declassified documents, one of serious and sustained concern. Not dismissal, concern. Late June, early July 1947. Something happens in the desert outside Roswell, New Mexico. The sequence of events at Roswell is so thoroughly documented, so extensively analyzed, and so deeply embedded in American popular culture that summarizing it risks either oversimplifying or sensationalizing. But let us try to stay with what the documented record actually shows. On or around the 2nd of July, 1947, something came down in a remote area of the New Mexico desert on the ranch of a farmer named W. Mac Brazel. Brazel found debris scattered across a wide area of his property. He reported it to the local sheriff. The sheriff contacted Roswell Army Airfield. The military response was immediate and, by the standards of the time, extraordinary. The Roswell Army Airfield issued a press release stating that personnel had recovered a flying disc. That press release went out on the 8th of July and was picked up by newspapers around the world. The following day, the story changed. A second press release was issued. The recovered material was not a flying disc. It was a weather balloon. Brigadier General Roger Ramey held a press conference in Fort Worth, Texas, displaying debris that he identified as weather balloon material. The flying disc story was retracted. and an episode that had lasted less than 48 hours in the public record went underground, where it would remain for decades before surfacing again with an intensity that no official denial has ever fully extinguished. The Roswell incident has been analyzed by researchers, journalists, former military personnel, and government investigators for nearly 8 decades. Entire books have been written about individual aspects of it. Congressional hearings have been held. Freedom of Information Act requests have produced thousands of pages of documents. What the documented record establishes is this: something came down near Roswell in early July of 1940. The initial military assessment was significant enough to generate a press release describing it as a flying disc. That assessment was reversed within 24 hours. The material was classified and removed to Wright Field in Ohio, which was the primary American facility for advanced aerospace research and foreign technology assessment. What the documented record does not establish, despite decades of investigation, is what the material actually was. The weather balloon explanation has been questioned by researchers on technical grounds. The size of the debris field, the character of the materials described by witnesses, and the intensity of the military response are all inconsistent with a standard weather balloon recovery. A later official explanation, offered in a 1994 Air Force report, attributed the Roswell debris to Project Mogul, a classified program using high-altitude balloons to monitor Soviet nuclear tests. This explanation accounts for some of the anomalies in the original story and is accepted by many mainstream analysts, but not all of the anomalies, and not all of the witnesses. And the question of why a classified balloon recovery would generate a press release describing a flying disc, a press release issued by a military public affairs officer who presumably knew what a weather balloon looked like, has never been satisfactorily resolved. September 18, 1947. The National Security Act of 1947 comes into full effect. The United States Air Force is established as an independent service branch, separate from the Army. The National Security Council is created. The position of Secretary of Defense is established, replacing the separate Secretaries of War and Navy, and the Central Intelligence Agency is formally established. The CIA, an organization specifically designed to collect, analyze, and act on intelligence that crossed the boundaries of existing agencies. An organization with a mandate broad enough to encompass virtually any category of information. An organization with classification authorities and operational capabilities that the existing military and diplomatic intelligence services did not possess. The timing of the CIA's creation, in the same year as Operation Highjump, the Arnold sighting, and the Roswell incident, is one of the most discussed elements of the 1947 pattern. Correlation is not causation. The CIA's creation was driven by many factors, most of them straightforwardly related to the emerging Cold War with the Soviet Union. The need for a centralized civilian intelligence capability had been recognized since before the war ended. But the specific authorities granted to the CIA and the specific institutional culture it developed in its early years suggest an organization designed to handle not just conventional intelligence, but something else. Something that required a level of secrecy and operational flexibility that existing institutions could not provide. December of 1947, 5 months after the Arnold sighting, 5 months after Roswell, 4 months after the CIA's creation. The United States Air Force establishes Project Sign. Its mission is to formally investigate reports of unidentified flying objects from a scientific and military standpoint. Project Sign is the first official American government program dedicated to the systematic investigation of UFO reports. Its existence is classified. Its findings are classified. Its personnel are sworn to secrecy. And its first director, in internal communications that were later partially declassified, describes the volume and quality of incoming reports as suggesting a phenomenon that demands serious scientific attention rather than institutional dismissal. Project Sign becomes Project Grudge in 1949. Project Grudge becomes Project Blue Book in 1952. Project Blue Book runs until 1969, when it is officially terminated with the conclusion that UFO reports represent no threat to national security and no evidence of extraterrestrial technology. But researchers who have examined the classified internal communications of these programs, as opposed to the public-facing summaries, describe a significant gap between what the programs were finding and what they were officially concluding. A gap that begins in 1947, the same year as Operation Highjump. Electromagnetic. Now I want to introduce a name that belongs in this story and that is rarely mentioned in the same breath as Operation Highjump, even though the connection is direct and documented. James Forrestal. Forrestal was the first United States Secretary of Defense, appointed under the newly created position established by the National Security Act. He had previously served as Secretary of the Navy, which means he was the senior civilian authority overseeing the Navy during Operation Highjump. He was directly in the chain of command for the expedition. He received its classified findings. Forrestal was one of the most powerful men in Washington in 1947. He was brilliant, driven, and deeply committed to what he believed was the existential importance of American strategic superiority over the Soviet Union. He was also, by multiple contemporary accounts, increasingly burdened by something in the months and years following 1947. His colleagues described a man under extraordinary psychological. Not the ordinary pressure of high office, which Forrestal had navigated with distinction for years. Something different. Something that seemed to be coming from inside, rather than from the external demands of his position. In March of 1949, Forrestal resigned as Secretary of Defense. He was taken immediately to Bethesda Naval Hospital, where he was admitted to the psychiatric ward. He was not allowed visitors for an extended period. His telephone calls were monitored. He was kept under close supervision. On the 22nd of May, 1949, James Forrestal fell from a window on the 16th floor of Bethesda Naval Hospital. He died from the fall. The official finding was suicide. The death of James Forrestal has been the subject of sustained and serious scrutiny for decades. A biography by Cornell Simpson, published in 1966, raised questions about the official account that have never been fully resolved. The circumstances of his hospitalization, the monitoring of his communications, the restrictions on his visitors, and certain physical details of the scene of his death have all been questioned by researchers who find the official account incomplete. I am not going to tell you that James Forrestal was murdered. I do not know that. The evidence for murder is circumstantial and contested. The evidence for a genuine psychiatric crisis in his final months is also real and documented. Powerful men under extraordinary pressure sometimes break. It happens. What I am going to tell you is this. James Forrestal was the senior civilian official overseeing Operation Highjump. He received its classified findings. In the months and years that followed, he became increasingly disturbed by something that his colleagues could not fully account for. He was removed from office and hospitalized under circumstances that were unusual enough to attract serious scrutiny. And he died before he could speak publicly about whatever it was that was tearing him apart. That sequence of events does not prove anything, but it fits a pattern, the pattern of 1947, the pattern of a year in which the United States government encountered something it could not explain, could not contain, and could not afford to discuss publicly. A year in which the institutional response was to build walls, classification, new agencies, new programs, new authorities. Walls designed not to keep enemies out, but to keep information in. Let us now look at the international dimension of 1947, because the anomalous aerial phenomena that were flooding American military and civilian reporting channels were not confined to American skies. In Sweden, a wave of mysterious aerial objects had been observed throughout 1946, described in the Swedish press as ghost rockets. These objects were observed flying over Scandinavia in numbers and with characteristics that the Swedish military took seriously enough to conduct a formal investigation. The investigation, which involved cooperation with American and British intelligence services, concluded that the objects were real physical phenomena whose origin could not be determined. Not weather, not hallucination, not conventional aircraft. Real, physical, unknown. The ghost rocket wave peaked in the summer of 1946 and continued into 1947. It overlapped precisely with the planning and execution phases of Operation Highjump. In Britain, the Air Ministry was receiving and classifying its own accumulation of unexplained aerial reports from military and civilian pilots. The British files, partially released in subsequent decades, show a pattern strikingly similar to the American experience. Objects moving at extraordinary speeds, performing maneuvers inconsistent with known aerodynamics, observed by credentialed witnesses whose reliability could not be questioned. In the Soviet Union, the internal security apparatus was tracking similar reports. The Soviet files on this subject remain largely inaccessible, but enough has emerged from defector accounts and post-Soviet partial releases to establish that Soviet military and intelligence authorities were dealing with the same category of phenomenon in the same period. Here is the picture that emerges when you lay all of this out. In 1947, across multiple continents and multiple nations, credible observers, including military pilots, civilian aviators, radar operators, and ground observers, were reporting aerial objects with capabilities that no human technology of that era possessed. At the same time, the United States sent its largest ever military expedition to the most remote region of the planet, led by its most experienced polar explorer, equipped with far more military hardware than any mapping mission could justify. That expedition came home early, in circumstances that the official record has never fully explained, and its leader made a public warning about aircraft of extraordinary capability that his government chose not to address. Within months of that expedition's return, the United States government underwent the most significant institutional reorganization in its history, creating new agencies with unprecedented classification authorities and a new military branch with primary responsibility for aerial operations. And in the same year, multiple specific incidents involving unidentified aerial objects occurred on American soil and were responded to with a level of institutional seriousness, including classification, physical evidence recovery, and the creation of dedicated investigation programs that is entirely inconsistent with the dismissive public posture the government would eventually adopt. What does this mean? It means that whatever the United States government encountered in 1947, it encountered it in multiple places, in multiple forms, and with enough consistency and seriousness to drive fundamental changes in how it organized itself to deal with unknown threats. Operation Highjump was one encounter in a year of encounters. Perhaps the most dramatic, perhaps the most direct, perhaps the one that, because of its scale and its military character, was the most alarming. But not the only one. And the response to all of these encounters, taken together, tells us something important. The American government in 1947 did not respond like an institution that had encountered something it believed was explainable with a little more investigation. It responded like an institution that had encountered something it did not understand and was not sure it could handle. It built walls. It created secrets. It established programs. It recruited scientists and intelligence officers and military analysts and told them to figure out what was happening and to do it quietly and to tell nobody outside the cleared community what they found. Those programs have never been fully terminated. Those secrets have never been fully released. And whatever drove the creation of that institutional apparatus in 1947, whatever made James Forrestal break under its weight, whatever made Richard Byrd speak out of turn to a Chilean journalist on a dockside in the autumn of his career, is still classified. Still locked away, still waiting. The treaty that divided the last continent. 1955. 8 years have passed since Operation Highjump. The Cold War has hardened into the permanent condition of global politics. The Soviet Union has tested its first atomic bomb. The Korean War has been fought to a stalemate. The hydrogen bomb exists. The world lives under the permanent shadow of annihilation. And Antarctica is becoming a problem. Not a military problem. Not yet, officially. A diplomatic problem. A jurisdictional problem. The kind of problem that accumulates slowly, in conference rooms and diplomatic cables, and quietly urgent conversations between foreign ministers, until it reaches a point where it can no longer be deferred. 7 nations are claiming territorial sovereignty over portions of Antarctica. Argentina, Australia, Chile, France, New Zealand, Norway, the United Kingdom. Their claims overlap in some cases. They conflict in others. The legal basis for each claim is disputed by the others, and by the growing number of nations that have begun to take an interest in the continent without making formal claims. Among those interested nations, moving with increasing purpose and resources toward a significant Antarctic presence, is the Soviet Union and the United States, neither of which has made a territorial claim, both of which intend to ensure that the other does not gain exclusive access to whatever Antarctica contains. The International Geophysical Year runs from the 1st of July, 1957, to the 31st of December, 1958. It is one of the largest coordinated scientific research programs in history, involving 67 nations and research programs spanning the full range of Earth sciences. Its Antarctic component involves 12 nations establishing research stations across the continent, many of them in locations that had never previously had a permanent human presence. The Soviet Union establishes Vostok Station, deep in the interior of East Antarctica, directly above the subglacial lake that will bear the station's name. The United States establishes Amundsen-Scott South Pole Station at the geographic South Pole itself. Multiple other nations establish coastal and interior stations. The scientific output of the International Geophysical Year is extraordinary. New understanding of the ionosphere, the magnetosphere, ocean currents, seismic activity, and the Antarctic ice sheet itself. It is a genuine triumph of international scientific cooperation, conducted in the shadow of the Cold War, with a level of multinational collaboration that the political climate of the time made genuinely remarkable. But something else is happening alongside the science, something that the public record of the International Geophysical Year does not fully capture. The 12 nations operating in Antarctica during the IGY are, for the first time, sharing territory and, in some cases, facilities in a region where no established legal framework governs their interactions. Their scientists are working side by side in conditions of extreme isolation. Their military logistics personnel, because all of the major Antarctic programs have significant military components, are operating in proximity to each other. And they are all seeing things. Not the same things necessarily, not in the same locations necessarily, but across the accounts of IGY participants from multiple nations, a consistent thread emerges. Antarctica is not behaving the way a simple, frozen continent should behave. The anomalies that Operation Highjump had encountered in 1947 are not one-time events. They are features of the environment, recurring. Documented by multiple independent observers from multiple nations. Magnetic anomalies, acoustic phenomena, unexplained atmospheric effects, and, in a number of cases, observations of aerial objects that do not match the aircraft of any participating nation. These observations are not prominently featured in the published scientific record of the IGY. They appear in the margins, in footnotes, in the private correspondence of researchers who are not sure what to do with data that does not fit their instrument's expected operating parameters. But they are there, and the governments receiving the reports from their Antarctic personnel are increasingly aware that they are all dealing with the same category of problem. In 1958, with the IGY drawing to a close, diplomatic conversations about the future status of Antarctica intensified dramatically. The conversations are held at multiple levels: public diplomatic channels, back-channel communications, intelligence sharing arrangements between nations that are otherwise adversaries. The urgency of the conversations and the unusually broad coalition of nations involved suggests that the impetus for a formal Antarctic agreement goes beyond the ordinary jurisdictional disputes over territorial claims. Something is driving these nations, nations that are locked in existential ideological conflict in every other arena of global politics, to find common ground on Antarctica with a speed and a unanimity that is without precedent in the diplomatic history of the Cold War. The Antarctic Treaty is signed on the 1st of December 1959 in Washington, D.C. It enters into force on the 23rd of June 1961. The original signatories are 12 nations, precisely the nations that participated in the International Geophysical Year Antarctic program. Let us look at what the Antarctic Treaty actually said. Because the specific provisions of the treaty are, in several respects, extraordinarily unusual for an international agreement of this kind. Article 1 declares that Antarctica shall be used for peaceful purposes only. Military bases, military maneuvers, and the testing of any weapons, including nuclear weapons, are prohibited. This is not unusual for an arms control agreement. Article 2 guarantees freedom of scientific investigation and cooperation in Antarctica. Also not unusual. Article 3 requires the exchange of scientific personnel and data between nations operating in Antarctica. Again, reasonable for a scientific cooperation agreement. Article 4 is where things become interesting. Article 4 freezes all territorial claims in Antarctica. It does not resolve them. It does not validate or invalidate any existing claim. It simply suspends them, indefinitely, in a state of diplomatic limbo. No new claims can be made. No existing claims can be extended. And no activity conducted during the treaty period can be used as the basis for asserting, supporting, or denying any territorial claim. This is a genuinely extraordinary legal construction. It means that Antarctica exists, in international law, in a permanent state of suspended sovereignty. No nation owns it. No nation can own it. And no activity on the continent, however extensive, however prolonged, however significant, changes that fundamental status. Why would the territorial claimant nations, nations that had been fiercely asserting their Antarctic sovereignty for decades, agree to permanently suspend those claims? The official answer is that they traded their claims for guaranteed access and the exclusion of potentially hostile powers. By agreeing to freeze claims, they ensured that the Soviet Union could not establish a sovereign presence, and they ensured their own continued access to the continent. That explanation is plausible as far as it goes. But Article 7 goes. Article 7 of the Antarctic Treaty establishes a right of inspection. Any treaty party can send observers to inspect any station, installation, or equipment in Antarctica, operated by any other treaty party, with advance notice but without the right of refusal. In 1959, at the height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union agreed that each could inspect the other's Antarctic installations on demand. This provision is without parallel in any other Cold War agreement. At a time when the two superpowers were spending enormous resources to prevent each other from gaining intelligence about their military facilities, they agreed to mutual inspection rights in Antarctica that they had never agreed to anywhere else. Why? The standard diplomatic explanation is that the inspection rights were necessary to verify compliance with the demilitarization provisions of Article 1. You cannot trust that a rival power has not established weapons facilities in a remote region unless you have the right to go and look. That explanation makes sense, but it raises its own question. If the inspection rights are there to verify demilitarization, what exactly were the negotiating parties afraid the other might be militarizing against? Each other? Or something else? There is a provision of the Antarctic Treaty that receives almost no attention in mainstream discussions of the agreement, but that researchers focused on the anomalous history of the continent have noted with great interest. The treaty contains no provision addressing the possibility of non-state or non-human presence in Antarctica. This sounds like a strange thing to note. International treaties generally address the behavior of nation-states, not hypothetical non-human entities. But consider the context. The 12 nations drafting this treaty in 1958 and 1959 had all conducted significant Antarctic operations in the preceding decade. They had all received reports from their Antarctic personnel of anomalous phenomena. They were all, according to the pattern of behavior we have been tracing, dealing with the same category of unexplained events. And yet the treaty they produced addresses every conceivable scenario involving nation-state behavior in Antarctica, while containing not a single provision addressing what should happen if Antarctic operations encounter something that is not the activity of any nation-state. The absence is conspicuous. Operation Deep Freeze begins in 1955, 2 years before the International Geophysical Year, and it continues to the present day. It is the United States military logistical support program for American Antarctic research operations. It is run by the United States Navy and later by the United States Air Force. It is, by any reasonable assessment, a military operation supporting a nominally civilian scientific program. The scale of Operation Deep Freeze has varied over the decades, but has consistently been substantial. At its peak in the 1960s and 70s, it involved multiple ships, dozens of aircraft, and hundreds of military personnel. Even in its reduced contemporary form, it represents a significant ongoing military commitment to the Antarctic region. Richard Byrd led the first deep freeze expedition in 1955 and 1956. He was 67 years old. He flew over the South Pole one final time in January of 1956, as we noted in an earlier chapter. What he saw on that final flight, what he thought as he looked down from altitude at the continent that had defined his life and haunted his final years, He died 14 months later, having never given a full public accounting of what Operation Highjump had found. The 1960s bring a new dimension to the Antarctic story. In July of 1962, the United States conducts a nuclear test called Starfish Prime. This is a high-altitude nuclear detonation, conducted at an altitude of approximately 400 kilometers above Johnston Island in the Pacific Ocean. It is part of a series of high-altitude nuclear tests called Operation Fishbowl. Starfish Prime produces effects that are significantly more dramatic than expected. The electromagnetic pulse from the detonation damages satellites in orbit. The artificial radiation belt created by the explosion persists in the magnetosphere for months. The visual effects are observed across a vast area of the Pacific. It also produces something that the monitoring stations in Antarctica record with unusual intensity. The electromagnetic disturbance generated by Starfish Prime propagates through the magnetosphere and produces conjugate effects. Mirror effects caused by the Earth's magnetic field geometry at the antipodal point, the point on the opposite side of the Earth directly connected by magnetic field lines. The antipodal point of Johnston Island is in the South Atlantic, close to the Antarctic region. The monitoring stations in Antarctica, operated by multiple nations under the IGY infrastructure that had been maintained after the formal program ended, recorded electromagnetic signatures from Starfish Prime that were, in the words of the technical reports, more intense and more complex than theoretical models predicted. Once again, Antarctica was not behaving the way a simple frozen continent should. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, the accumulation of anomalous data from Antarctic monitoring programs continued. The seismic monitoring network, expanded and improved from the IGY infrastructure, records events that do not match the signatures of earthquakes or nuclear tests. The infrasound monitoring network records acoustic signals of uncertain origin. Magnetic observatory data shows variations that are difficult to account for with available geological models. None of this data is secret. It is published in scientific journals. It is discussed at Antarctic research conferences. It is analyzed by researchers at institutions around the world. But it is published in the specialized literature of Antarctic geophysics, in journals read by a small community of specialists, in language that is necessarily technical and inaccessible to non-specialists. It does not reach the public in any form that connects it to Operation Highjump, to Byrd's warning, to the anomalous events of 1947. The dots exist. They are in the published record. Nobody is connecting them. In 1988, a Soviet scientist named Andrei Kapitsa, working at Vostok Station, identifies the first definitive evidence of a massive subglacial lake beneath the ice. This is the discovery that will eventually be confirmed as Lake Vostok, the largest known subglacial lake on Earth. Kapitsa's finding is based on seismic data and radio echo sounding surveys. It is a genuine scientific discovery of the first order. It is published in the scientific literature and eventually receives the international attention it deserves. But within the community of Soviet Antarctic researchers, Kapitsa's discovery is accompanied by another observation that receives far less attention. The seismic data that reveals the outline of Lake Vostok also reveals something about the acoustic environment of the region directly above the lake that does not fit the expected parameters for a body of water beneath 4 kilometers of ice. The details of this observation are buried in technical appendices of Soviet Antarctic research reports from the late 1980s and early 1990s. They were not widely circulated. They were not translated into English until years later, and by the time they entered the broader research community's awareness, the political and scientific context had shifted enough that their anomalous character was largely noted and filed rather than pursued. But researchers who have looked carefully at those appendices describe data suggesting that the acoustic environment above Lake Vostok is not consistent with a passive body of liquid water. It is consistent with something that moves. The Antarctic Treaty has been updated and expanded over the decades since its original signing. The Protocol on Environmental Protection, adopted in 1991 and entering into force in 1998, adds significant environmental protection provisions and explicitly prohibits mineral resource activities in Antarctica for a period of at least 50 years from its entry into force. The protocol is presented as an environmental protection measure, and in many respects it genuinely is. The Antarctic environment is extraordinarily fragile and vulnerable to human activity, and the protocol's provisions are scientifically justified. But the mineral resource prohibition has an effect beyond environmental protection. It prevents the systematic commercial exploration of the Antarctic subsurface. It prevents the kind of large-scale drilling and excavation programs that would, as a byproduct of commercial resource extraction, produce a comprehensive picture of what is actually beneath the Antarctic ice. A comprehensive picture that governments and scientific institutions with access to classified Antarctic data apparently do not want in the public domain. Today, access to Antarctica is governed by a framework that is, in practical terms, more restrictive than the access framework for any other region of the planet. To conduct research in Antarctica, you must be affiliated with a national Antarctic program. You must have your research proposal reviewed and approved by that program. Your activities on the continent are subject to the inspection provisions of the Antarctic Treaty. You must file detailed plans for your movements and activities. You are, in the most remote and theoretically most accessible wilderness on Earth, more regulated and more monitored than you would be doing equivalent research in any inhabited region. Certain areas of Antarctica are designated as Antarctic Specially Protected Areas, ASPAs, under the Environmental Protocol. Access to these areas requires specific permits and is restricted even for researchers affiliated with national programs. The justification for these restrictions is environmental protection, the preservation of pristine ecosystems from human contamination. That justification is real. It is scientifically valid. The Antarctic environment is genuinely fragile. But the distribution of Antarctic specially protected areas shows a pattern that some researchers have noted with interest. Several of the most intensively protected areas correspond geographically to regions that were identified as anomalous in the Operation Highjump records. Regions where the 1947 expedition's aircraft reported the most significant operational difficulties. Regions where the magnetic anomaly readings were most intense. Regions that the expedition's photographic record, still not fully released, apparently documented with particular thoroughness. In 2012, a paper published in the journal Geophysical Research Letters by researchers from the University of Texas Institute for Geophysics used satellite gravity data to produce the most detailed map yet of the subglacial topography of Antarctica. The paper was a significant scientific achievement. It revealed previously unknown features of the Antarctic bedrock, including deep subglacial basins, mountain ranges, and drainage channels that had not been detectable with previous survey methods. It also revealed, in a region of West Antarctica that overlaps with the area most intensively surveyed by Operation Highjump, a subglacial feature of unusual character. A basin, approximately the size of the American state of New Mexico, that sits significantly below sea level and is connected to the Southern Ocean through subglacial drainage channels. The researchers describe this feature in straightforward geological terms. A subglacial basin of tectonic origin, consistent with the geological history of the West Antarctic Rift system. That description is almost certainly correct. But the feature's characteristics, its depth below sea level, its connection to the ocean through subglacial channels, and its thermal profile driven by the mantle plume beneath Marie Byrd Land, mean that it represents an environment unlike anything else on Earth's surface. An environment that has been sealed from direct observation for millions of years. An environment that, under the right thermal and geological conditions, could sustain a level of biological or even physical complexity that our surface-based models of what is possible have no framework for. We began this chapter with the question of why 12 nations, including bitter Cold War adversaries, came together with extraordinary speed and unusual unanimity to create the Antarctic Treaty in 1950. We have followed the thread of Antarctic anomalies through the International Geophysical Year, through the nuclear testing program, through the decades of monitoring data, through the geological discoveries of the modern era. And we are left with a picture that the treaty itself seems designed to manage rather than resolve. Antarctica is the most unusual piece of real estate on Earth. Its geology is extraordinary. Its subglacial environment is unlike anything else on the planet. Its electromagnetic and acoustic properties are anomalous in ways that 70 years of scientific monitoring have documented but not explained. The nations that know it best have agreed, collectively and without exception, to treat it as permanently off-limits to sovereignty, permanently subject to mutual inspection, permanently protected from the kind of systematic commercial development that would reveal the full character of what lies beneath the ice. And the man who knew it better than any of them, the man who spent his life flying over its emptiness and sitting alone in its silence, and leading armies of soldiers into its ice, that man came home from his last great expedition and warned the world about something in its skies. The warning was buried. The treaty was signed. The secrets were locked away. And Antarctica waits, as it has always waited. Vast, cold, silent. And, if the evidence we have been tracing is any guide, not nearly as empty as it appears. What modern eyes are seeing. 2026. Nearly 80 years have passed since Operation Highjump. The men who sailed south in December of 1946 are gone. Richard Byrd is gone. James Forrestal is gone. The sailors and pilots and scientists who came home from the ice with orders not to talk are gone. But Antarctica is still there, and the anomalies are still there. And now, for the first time in history, we have tools that the men of 1947 could not have imagined. Satellites in permanent orbit, ground-penetrating radar systems of extraordinary resolution, global seismic and infrasound monitoring networks, ice-penetrating sonar, remotely operated underwater vehicles, machine learning algorithms capable of processing vast data sets and identifying patterns that human analysts would miss. We are looking at Antarctica with better eyes than any previous generation has possessed, and what we are seeing is raising questions that the official scientific literature is struggling to contain within its normal frameworks. Let us start with what is publicly visible, what anyone with an internet connection can see if they know where to look. Google Earth has transformed the way ordinary people interact with geographic data. Satellite imagery of virtually every point on the Earth's surface is available at resolutions that would have been classified military intelligence a generation ago. Remote mountains, uninhabited islands, the depths of the Amazon, the interior of the Sahara, all of it visible, all of it accessible. Antarctica is on Google Earth. But Antarctica on Google Earth is not like anywhere else on Google Earth. Researchers and amateur investigators who have spent time examining the Antarctic imagery have documented a consistent pattern. Certain regions of Antarctica appear in the satellite imagery at significantly lower resolution than the surrounding areas, not because of cloud cover, which is obvious and variable, because the imagery itself has been processed in a way that reduces its resolution in specific locations. This is not a technical artifact of how satellite imagery is compiled. High-resolution imagery of Antarctica exists. It has been captured by military and civilian satellites for decades. The processing decisions that determine what resolution appears in publicly accessible platforms like Google Earth are made by people, not algorithms. Someone decided that certain parts of Antarctica should not be visible at full resolution in the public database. Which parts? Several of the locations where resolution is conspicuously reduced correspond to areas that appear in the Operation Highjump record as regions of particular operational interest. The Marie Byrd Land region. Certain sections of the coastal area around the Thurston Peninsula. The interior region above the West Antarctic Subglacial Basin, identified in the 2012 University of Texas study. This observation has been made by multiple independent researchers examining the Google Earth imagery. It is not a single person's claim. The pattern is there, and it is reproducible. In 2016, a team of researchers from the Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany, one of the world's leading polar research institutions, published a study in the journal The Cryosphere, describing the results of an extensive airborne survey of the Pine Island Glacier region in West Antarctica. The Pine Island Glacier is one of the most intensively studied glaciers on Earth because of its critical role in the stability of the West Antarctic ice sheet. It is losing mass faster than virtually any other glacier in Antarctica, and its potential contribution to global sea level rise is a subject of significant scientific concern. The Alfred Wegener study used ice-penetrating radar to map the subglacial topography beneath the glacier in unprecedented detail. What it found, in addition to the expected features of a glacier system losing mass to basal melting, was a series of subglacial cavities, empty spaces between the ice and the bedrock, of a size and distribution that the researchers described as inconsistent with the expected pattern of basal melt alone. The cavities were too large, too regularly distributed. Their geometry did not match the random, irregular pattern that purely thermal processes produce. Of some of the larger cavities, and their spatial distribution relative to the subglacial drainage system, are features that other researchers have looked at and found difficult to fully account for with the proposed geological mechanism. The Pine Island Glacier region is, incidentally, directly adjacent to the Thurston Peninsula, the area where the eastern group of Operation Highjump was operating in January of 1947, the area associated with the George I incident. The WAIS Divide Ice Core project ran from 2007 to 2012, drilling through the West Antarctic ice sheet at a location in Marie Byrd Land to extract an ice core nearly 3,500 meters long. The core represents approximately 68,000 years of Antarctic climate history, preserved in the layered structure of the ice. The project was a collaboration between multiple American universities and research institutions, funded by the National Science Foundation. Its primary scientific objective was to reconstruct the climate history of the last glacial cycle with unprecedented resolution. The published results of the WAIS Divide project are extraordinary and have contributed enormously to our understanding of past climate. They are available in the peer-reviewed literature and have been widely discussed in the scientific community. But there is an aspect of the WAIS Divide drilling program that received almost no public attention. During the drilling operation, at depths corresponding to approximately 40,000 years before the present, the drill encountered a layer that the project's technical reports describe as containing material of uncertain composition that caused drilling difficulties and required a modification of the drilling protocol. The description of this material in the technical literature is brief and unremarkable. Drilling difficulties are common in deep ice core projects. The modification of protocol is described as routine. But researchers who have looked carefully at the acoustic and radar data collected during the WAIS Divide drilling program have noted that the depth at which the drilling difficulties occurred corresponds to a layer that shows anomalous acoustic properties in the radar survey data. A layer that reflects radar energy in a pattern more consistent with a structured surface than with the irregular stratigraphy of natural ice deposition. The project's published papers do not address this observation directly. Whether the anomaly was noted and dismissed, noted and classified, or simply not noticed in the volume of data generated by the project is not clear from the public record. In 2018, NASA's Operation Icebridge, the most extensive airborne survey of the polar ice sheets ever conducted, completed its Antarctic survey season with a discovery that generated significant scientific attention. Flying over the Wilkes Land region of East Antarctica, Icebridge's ice-penetrating radar detected a massive subglacial structure beneath approximately 1.5 kilometers of ice. The structure was approximately 450 kilometers across and rose approximately 800 meters above the surrounding. The researchers from the University of Edinburgh and NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory proposed that the structure represented the remnant of a massive ancient impact crater, comparable in size to the Chicxulub crater associated with the mass extinction 66 million years ago. This interpretation was discussed seriously in the scientific community. Impact craters of this size are known to exist on other planets. Finding one buried under the Antarctic ice would be an extraordinary discovery, but not an impossible one. But other researchers, examining the same data, noted features of the structure's geometry that were not entirely consistent with the expected characteristics of an impact crater. The rim structure was unusually regular. The central elevation was unusually pronounced. The relationship between the structure's geometry and the surrounding subglacial topography raised questions that the impact crater model did not fully resolve. The debate about the Wilkes Land anomaly continues in the scientific literature. It has not been resolved. Further investigation has been hampered by the difficulty of accessing the region, which is in the interior of East Antarctica, and requires significant logistical resources to reach. The CTBTO infrasound monitoring network that we mentioned in an earlier chapter continues to operate and continues to detect anomalous signals from the Antarctic region. The network's data is not fully public. Station data is shared with member states and with approved research institutions, but the complete dataset is not openly accessible. Researchers who have worked with CTBTO data from Antarctic stations describe a persistent background of signals that do not fit the standard categories of natural infrasound sources. These signals are not dramatic. They are not the kind of thing that generates headlines. They are subtle, recurrent, and deeply puzzling to the specialists who analyze them. A paper published in the Journal of Geophysical Research in 2019 by researchers from the University of Alaska Fairbanks analyzed infrasound data from Antarctic monitoring stations and identified a category of signals they termed Antarctic non-seismic infrasound events. The paper proposed several possible natural explanations, including interactions between atmospheric pressure waves and the ice sheet surface, oceanic microseisms, and katabatic wind effects. None of the proposed explanations fully accounted for all of the observed signal characteristics. The paper concluded that further investigation was required. That is the careful language of scientists who have found something they cannot explain. In 2022, a multinational research team published a study in Nature Geoscience describing the results of a comprehensive seismic survey of the subglacial environment beneath Thwaites Glacier, the so-called Doomsday Glacier, whose potential collapse is considered one of the most significant near-term risks to global sea levels. The seismic survey was one of the most detailed ever conducted in Antarctica. It used an array of seismic sensors deployed across the glacier surface to map the subglacial environment with resolution sufficient to identify features as small as a few meters across. The published results focused on the implications of the survey for Thwaites Glacier's stability and the mechanisms driving its accelerating mass loss. This is the information that is scientifically most urgent and most publicly relevant. But buried in the supplementary data of the Nature Geoscience paper is a section describing seismic signals recorded during the survey period that the authors classify as non-tectonic events of uncertain origin. Non-tectonic seismic events in Antarctica are not unusual in themselves. Ice movement generates seismic signals. Calving events generate seismic signals. Subglacial water movement generates seismic signals. But the signals described in the supplementary data have characteristics that distinguish them from these known sources. Their frequency content is unusual. Their spatial distribution does not correspond to the glacier's known drainage system. And their temporal pattern, the timing of when they occur, shows a regularity that natural random processes do not typically produce. Regularity. In seismic signals from beneath one of the most remote and least accessible places on Earth. Let us talk about the no-fly zones. Antarctica has a formal air traffic management framework administered by the International Civil Aviation Organization. Navigation in Antarctic airspace is complex because of the magnetic anomalies that affect compass navigation and the extreme weather conditions that can develop without warning. But within that framework, there are specific regions of Antarctica where flight operations by non-affiliated aircraft are not merely discouraged, but are effectively prohibited by the combination of formal restrictions, logistics, and the absence of any infrastructure to support emergency response. These effectively prohibited zones are not formally designated as no-fly zones in the legal sense of the term. They are simply regions where the combination of remoteness, lack of navigation infrastructure, absence of emergency support, and formal permit requirements makes independent flight operations impossible for all practical purposes. The geographic distribution of these effectively inaccessible zones overlaps, in several cases, with regions that appear repeatedly in the anomalous data we have been discussing. The interior of East Antarctica above Lake Vostok and its neighboring subglacial lakes. The Marie Byrd land region above the mantle plume. Certain sections of the coastline in the Amundsen Sea sector. Whether the inaccessibility of these zones is a deliberate management decision or simply the product of geography and logistics is impossible to determine from the public record, but the pattern is there. In 2023, the European Space Agency released a new generation of satellite gravity data from its GOCE mission, the Gravity Field and Steady-State Ocean Circulation Explorer. The GOCE data provided the most precise map yet of the Earth's gravitational field, with resolution sufficient to detect density variations in the crust and upper mantle at scales previously impossible to measure from orbit. The Antarctic portion of the GOCE gravity data revealed several gravitational anomalies in the continental interior that do not correspond to known geological features. Anomalies suggesting either unusual crustal density variations or subsurface structures that have not been previously identified. The most pronounced of these anomalies is located in a region of East Antarctica that has received relatively little scientific attention compared to the more intensively studied West Antarctic regions. It is not in any of the areas where existing research stations are located. It is not covered by any of the major airborne survey programs. It is, in the most literal sense, one of the least investigated patches of land surface on Earth. The ESA paper describing the GOCE Antarctic gravity data discusses the anomalies in straightforward geophysical terms. Possible variations in crustal thickness. Possible remnant density contrasts from ancient tectonic events. Possible mantle dynamics. These explanations are scientifically reasonable. They are also unverified. Because nobody has been to that location, nobody has drilled there, nobody has conducted ground-based geophysical surveys there. It is a gravitational anomaly of unknown origin in one of the most remote places on Earth. And it is sitting there, in the published scientific literature, quietly waiting for someone to go and look. The most recent chapter in the modern monitoring story involves something that would have been science fiction in 1947: artificial intelligence analysis of Antarctic satellite data. In 2024, researchers at the British Antarctic Survey published a study describing the application of machine learning algorithms to the analysis of decades of satellite radar imagery of the Antarctic ice sheet. The algorithms were trained to identify patterns in the imagery that might indicate subglacial features or ice sheet dynamics not visible to conventional analysis. The results included the identification of numerous previously unknown subglacial drainage features, ice sheet flow patterns, and bedrock structures. The paper is a significant methodological advance in Antarctic remote sensing and has been widely cited in the subsequent literature. But the researchers also noted in a brief section of the paper that the algorithms had flagged a category of signals in the radar imagery that did not correspond to any of the known feature types in their training dataset. These unclassified signals were distributed across the ice sheet in a pattern that did not match the distribution of any known geological or glaciological feature. The paper described these signals as artifacts of uncertain origin, requiring further investigation. Machine learning algorithms trained on comprehensive datasets of known Antarctic features are identifying something in the data that does not match any known Antarctic feature. In 2024, nearly 80 years after Richard Byrd came home from Operation Highjump and warned about something in the Antarctic skies that moved at speeds no human technology could match. The picture that emerges from the modern monitoring data is not the picture of a simple frozen continent that holds no secrets. It is the picture of a place that is actively generating anomalous signals across multiple independent monitoring systems: gravitational, seismic, infrasonic, electromagnetic, radar. All of them, independently and without coordination, producing data that falls outside the expected parameters for a passive geological environment. None of this data, taken individually, constitutes proof of anything extraordinary. But taken together, across 8 decades of accumulating observations from increasingly sophisticated monitoring systems operated by multiple independent nations and institutions, the picture is of a place that is significantly stranger than its official description allows. A place where the ice conceals a world we have not yet mapped. A place where the signals coming up from beneath do not fit our models. A place where the things that move in the sky above it have not always been identifiable as the products of any known human technology. And a place that the nations of the world have collectively decided, through the remarkable legal architecture of the Antarctic Treaty, to place permanently beyond the reach of any single power's sovereignty or any commercial interest's systematic exploration, as if they know that what is down there should not be in anyone's hands, as if they know that the last thing any of them want is for whatever is beneath that ice to be disturbed, as if the lesson of 1947, the lesson that 5,000 soldiers learned in 8 weeks and carried home in silence, was that Antarctica is not a place to conquer. It is a place to watch. From a careful distance, with very respectful eyes. What we know, what we don't, and why it matters. Now, let us take a breath. We have covered a lot of ground. From the docks of Norfolk in December of 1946 to the satellite gravity maps of 2023. From Richard Byrd's Medal of Honor to the machine learning algorithms flagging unclassified signals in Antarctic radar imagery. From the classified photographs locked in military archives to the gravitational anomalies sitting quietly in published ESA data, waiting for someone to go and look. It is time to do what good journalism and good science demands. It is time to separate what we actually know from what we are inferring, what is documented from what is suggested, what is proven from what is possible. Because the story of Operation Highjump deserves that honesty. It is too important and too serious to be buried under either institutional silence or uncritical myth. Let us start with what is unambiguously true. It is true that the United States military launched Operation Highjump in December of 1946. It is true that the expedition comprised 13 ships, 23 aircraft, and approximately 4,700 military personnel. It is true that the mission was planned for 8 months and terminated after approximately 8 weeks. It is true that the official reason given for the early termination, deteriorating weather conditions, is inconsistent with the planned timeline and with the actual weather window available at the time of departure. These are facts. They are documented in the official record. They are not disputed by mainstream historians. It is true that Richard Byrd gave an interview to the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio in March of 1947, in which he warned about enemy aircraft capable of flying from pole to pole at incredible speeds. The interview is documented. The warning is on the record. It has never been officially addressed or explained by the United States government. These are facts. It is true that large portions of the photographic and documentary record of Operation Highjump were classified and have never been fully released to the public. It is true that the United States government created the CIA, the NSC, and the Independent Air Force in the same year that Operation Highjump was conducted and terminated. It is true that Project Sign, the first official American UFO investigation program, was established in December of 1947, within months of the expedition's return. These are facts. It is true that the Antarctic Treaty of 1959 contains provisions, particularly around territorial suspension and mutual inspection rights, that are without parallel in any other international agreement of the Cold War period. It is true that the treaty was negotiated and signed with unusual speed and unusual unanimity by nations that were otherwise locked in bitter ideological conflict. These are facts. It is true that modern scientific monitoring programs, including seismic networks, infrasound arrays, satellite gravity missions, and airborne radar surveys, have identified anomalous signals and features in Antarctica that have not been fully explained by available geological and geophysical models. These are facts. They are in the peer-reviewed literature. Now, let us be equally honest about what we do not know, about where the evidence ends and the inference begins. We do not know what caused the early termination of Operation Highjump beyond what the official record states. We do not know what the classified photographic archive contains. We do not know what the classified summary report to the Joint Chiefs of Staff described. We do not know what Richard Byrd saw over Antarctica that drove him to make his extraordinary warning in language that overrode his lifelong institutional. We do not know whether the aircraft incidents described in second-hand accounts by expedition veterans represented encounters with something anomalous, or whether they represented the kind of severe weather events and mechanical failures that Antarctic operations genuinely produce. We do not know whether the anomalous signals in the modern monitoring data represent unknown geological processes, unknown biological activity, or something that does not fit either of those categories. We do not know whether the classification decisions around Operation Highjump represent legitimate Cold War security concerns, evidence of something the government found and did not want to disclose, or some combination of both. We do not know, and intellectual honesty requires that we say so clearly, without embarrassment and without the temptation to fill the gaps with certainty that the evidence does not support. But here is what intellectual honesty also requires. It requires us to acknowledge that the gaps themselves are meaningful. A gap in the official record is not nothing. A classification decision is not nothing. A warning from the most credentialed polar explorer in American history, ignored by his government and never addressed in the 80 years since, is not nothing. The absence of an official explanation for an anomaly does not mean the anomaly does not exist. It means it has not been explained. Those are two very different things. And when you have multiple independent anomalies across multiple decades, across multiple monitoring systems, all pointing in the same geographic direction, toward the same continent, toward the same regions within that continent that appear repeatedly in the Operation Highjump record, that convergence is significant, not proof. Let us now look at the three most serious explanations for the totality of what we have examined and assess them with the rigor they deserve. The first explanation is the conventional one. Operation Highjump was a Cold War military operation driven primarily by strategic competition with the Soviet Union. Its premature termination was caused by a combination of genuine operational difficulties, the severity of Antarctic conditions exceeding planning assumptions, and a reassessment of strategic priorities in Washington as the Cold War began to crystallize. The classification of its findings was driven by legitimate security concerns about denying geographic and tactical information to the Soviet Union. Byrd's warning was a conventional strategic assessment about Soviet polar aviation capability, expressed with unusual urgency because Byrd genuinely believed the United States was not taking the polar threat seriously enough. This explanation accounts for many of the documented facts. It is coherent. It does not require anything extraordinary, and it should be the default explanation in the absence of compelling evidence to the contrary. But it does not fully account for several things. It does not account for the specific language of Byrd's warning, which describes aircraft capability that exceeded anything the Soviet Union possessed in 1947 by a margin so vast that conventional strategic assessment would not use that kind of language. It does not account for the anomalous character of the aircraft incidents as described in the second-hand testimony. It does not account for the unusually high classification level applied to specific incident reports. And it does not account for the modern monitoring data, which is entirely independent of the Cold War context and which continues to produce anomalous signals from the same regions. The conventional explanation is incomplete. The second explanation is the German remnant theory. Operation Highjump was sent to locate and assess the remnants of Nazi Antarctic activity, which was more substantial than publicly acknowledged, and which had produced or was continuing to produce aircraft technology significantly more advanced than anything in the public Allied inventory. The expedition found evidence of this capability, possibly encountered it directly, and returned in a classified state of alarm that drove the broader institutional response of 1947. This explanation has the advantage of accounting for the military composition of the expedition and for Byrd's description of the threat as aircraft, technology, something built rather than natural. But it fails on the evidence. Decades of serious historical research into the Nazi Antarctic program have not produced evidence of a functioning Antarctic base of any significant capability. The German Schwabenland expedition of 1938 and 39 was real and documented, but it was an aerial survey mission that lasted 3 weeks and established no permanent infrastructure. The captured German records analyzed by Allied intelligence after the war contained no evidence of a subsequent permanent installation. The advanced aircraft programs that Nazi Germany was developing at the war's end were real, but were nowhere near the capability implied by Byrd's warning. And the engineering and logistical requirements for maintaining a functioning aircraft development program in Antarctica in 1947 without any known supply chain are so extreme as to be effectively impossible. The German remnant theory is dramatic and appealing, and almost certainly wrong. The third explanation is the one that the official record most strenuously avoids, and that the evidence most stubbornly refuses to allow us to entirely dismiss. That Antarctica contains, or conceals, something that is not the product of any known human program. Something with technological capability that exceeds what any nation possessed in 1947. Something that the United States government encountered during Operation Highjump, assessed as a genuine threat, or at minimum, a genuine unknown, and has been quietly monitoring and managing ever since. This explanation accounts for the full range of anomalies in the record. Byrd's warning, the early termination, the classification decisions, the speed and unanimity of the Antarctic Treaty negotiations, the ongoing anomalous signals in the modern monitoring data, the institutional response of 1947, including the CIA and the UFO investigation programs. All of it fits, in the way that a key fits a lock, into the framework of a government that has encountered something it cannot explain, and has decided that the safest response is to contain the information, monitor the situation, and tell the public nothing. The problem with this explanation is the same problem it has always had. The evidence for it, while suggestive, is not conclusive. The anomalies are real, but individually explicable. The second-hand testimony is consistent, but unverified. The classification decisions are suspicious, but not probative. The convergence of independent anomalies is striking, but not definitive. We are left, after 80 years and all the investigative tools that modernity provides, in the same place that Richard Byrd left us in March of 1947, with a warning that has not been answered, with questions that have not been addressed, with a continent that is generating signals we do not fully understand. Why does this matter now, in 2026? Because Antarctica is changing. The West Antarctic ice sheet is losing mass at an accelerating rate. The Thwaites Glacier, which alone contains enough ice to raise global sea levels by approximately 65 centimeters if it collapses completely, is retreating faster than models projected. The warming of the Southern Ocean is driving changes in Antarctic biology, glaciology, and oceanography that are transforming the continent's environment on a timescale measured in decades rather than millennia. As the ice retreats, things that have been hidden under it for thousands or millions of years are becoming accessible for the first time. Coastlines that were under ice when Operation Highjump sailed south are now open water for parts of the year. Subglacial features that were kilometers beneath the surface are coming closer to it as the ice above them thins. And the subglacial drainage system is becoming more active, pumping water between lakes and toward the coast in ways that are changing the thermal and hydrological environment of the entire subglacial world. Whatever is down there, if anything is down there, is in an environment that is changing faster than at any point in the last 10,000 years. And the nations that signed the Antarctic Treaty in 1959, the nations that collectively decided that this continent should remain beyond the reach of any single power's sovereignty or any commercial interests' systematic exploration, are watching that change with an attention that goes beyond what the published scientific literature fully reveals. There is another reason why this matters now. The global conversation about unidentified aerial phenomena has changed dramatically in the years since Operation Highjump. In 2017, the New York Times published a story revealing the existence of the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, a classified Pentagon program that had been studying unidentified aerial phenomena from 2007 to 2000. The program's existence had been entirely unknown to the public. Its findings, partially released, described encounters by military pilots with objects displaying flight characteristics that no known aircraft could achieve. This was not a fringe publication. This was the New York Times, citing named sources with security clearances, describing a classified government program that had concluded that some unidentified aerial phenomena represent genuine unknowns that existing scientific and intelligence frameworks cannot account for. In 2021, the United States government released a report on unidentified aerial phenomena prepared by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. The report, which examined 144 reports of UAP from military sources, concluded that the majority could not be explained and that a small number displayed capabilities, including unusual acceleration, high speed, and the ability to operate in multiple domains, including air and water, that no known human technology could account for. That is an official United States government document stating that objects with no known human origin are operating in American airspace and transitioning between air and water. In 2022, Congress established the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, a permanent government body dedicated to detecting, identifying, and attributing unidentified anomalous phenomena. In 2023, a former intelligence official named David Grush testified under oath before Congress that the United States government has, for decades, been operating a program to recover and reverse engineer non-human technology. His testimony was explosive. It has not been officially confirmed, but it was given under oath by a named individual with documented security clearances in a formal congressional. The institutional landscape around this subject has shifted fundamentally in the 8 years since 2017. The subject that was dismissed, officially and emphatically, for decades, is now the subject of congressional oversight, official government reporting, and permanent institutional attention. And nobody in any of those official contexts has explained where the phenomenon began. Nobody has asked, officially and on the record, whether the history of official encounters with unidentified aerial phenomena of non-human apparent origin begins not in 2007, when the ATIP program was established, but in 1947, when 5,000 American soldiers went to Antarctica and came home 8 weeks early. Here is what I believe, and I want to be clear that this is interpretive, not factual. It is my reading of the evidence, not a claim about what the evidence proves. I believe that Operation Highjump encountered something in Antarctica that the American government classified immediately and has never publicly disclosed. I believe that what they encountered was sufficiently anomalous, sufficiently capable, and sufficiently inexplicable within the framework of 1947 knowledge to drive an institutional response of extraordinary scope and speed. I believe that Richard Byrd's warning was genuine, was based on direct observation or direct knowledge of direct observation, and was suppressed not because it was wrong, but because the government did not know what to do with it. I believe that the Antarctic Treaty represents, at least in part, a collective decision by the nations most knowledgeable about Antarctica to place the continent under a management framework specifically designed to prevent any single power from attempting to exploit or disturb whatever is there. And I believe that the modern monitoring data, the signals that multiple independent systems continue to detect and cannot explain, suggests that whatever Operation Highjump encountered in 1947 did not leave, that it is still there, that it has always been there, that Antarctica, the last great wilderness, the last unowned territory, the last place on Earth where the human footprint is genuinely light, is not as empty as it appears. But here is the harder truth that sits beneath all of that. We may never know. The classified archives of Operation Highjump are still classified. The full photographic record has never been released. The summary report to the Joint Chiefs of Staff remains beyond public access. The men who were there are gone. The Antarctic Treaty shows no signs of being renegotiated in ways that would open the continent to the kind of systematic investigation that might answer the outstanding questions. The nations that signed it in 1959 continue to add parties and strengthen its provisions rather than weaken them. The official UAP investigation apparatus, despite its unprecedented public visibility, has produced no official disclosure that connects the contemporary phenomenon to the Antarctic history we have been tracing. And the ice is melting. Whatever it conceals is either becoming more accessible or, if it has agency, is adapting to its changing environment in ways we are not equipped to detect. The questions that Richard Byrd's warning raised in 1947 are still open. They are, if anything, more urgent than they were then, because we now have the tools to look more carefully than anyone in 1947 could have imagined. And what our tools are showing us is that Antarctica is stranger and more active and more significant than the official story has ever acknowledged. 5,000 soldiers went to the bottom of the world. They came home in 8 weeks. Their commander warned humanity about something in the sky that moved at speeds no human technology could match. His government buried the warning. The world moved on, and in the frozen silence of the most remote continent on Earth, in the dark water beneath 4 kilometers of ancient ice, in the subglacial cavities mapped by radar and gravity satellites and machine learning algorithms, in the anomalous signals that have been accumulating in the monitoring data for 8 decades, something continues. Something that was there before we arrived. Something that will be there after we are gone. Something that has been watching us watch it across the 80 years since Richard Byrd looked down from his cockpit at the Antarctic ice and saw something that changed him forever. We do not know what it is. We have never been told. And perhaps the most honest thing we can say, after everything we have examined in this video, is that the question itself matters. That the act of asking it, seriously and rigorously and without flinching from where the evidence leads, is important. That a civilization capable of splitting the atom and mapping the human genome and sending machines to the edge of the solar system owes it to itself to take seriously the possibility that it is not alone on its own planet. That the last great unknown is not in space, it is at the bottom of the world, and it is waiting for us to find the courage to look. If this video made you think differently about Antarctica, about what we know and what we are not being told, leave a comment below. Tell me which part of this story surprised you most. Tell me what you think happened in those 8 weeks. Tell me what you think Byrd saw. Because this conversation is one that the official record has been refusing to have for 80 years. It is time we had it ourselves. In space, it is at the bottom of the world, and it is waiting for us to find the courage to look. If this video made you think differently about Antarctica, about what we know and what we are not being told, leave a comment below. Tell me which part of this story surprised you most. Tell me what you think happened in those 8 weeks. Tell me what you think Byrd saw. Because this conversation is one that the official record has been refusing to have for 80 years. It is time we had it ourselves.